The flames danced in the stone fireplace, casting long shadows across the cabin's wooden walls. Outside, the Colorado mountains disappeared beneath a furious blanket of white, the howling wind a mournful chorus against the sturdy logs. Inside, Dr. Mason Reed meticulously set 3 places at the small oak dining table. 3 white plates positioned with surgical precision. 3 crystal glasses polished to perfection. 3 folded napkins, each with a sprig of pine tucked inside Eleanor's favorite holiday touch. Mason, tall and lean, with a salt and pepper beard he hadn't bothered to trim in months, moved with the deliberate care of someone performing sacred rites. His once steady surgeon's hands now trembled slightly as he uncorked the bottle of Cabernet, the same vintage he'd shared with Eleanor on their last anniversary. His blue eyes, once described by colleagues as intensely focused, now carried a hollow distance as if perpetually looking at something no one else could see. He poured wine into each glass, filling them exactly halfway. The ritual had become second nature over the past 3 years, the same motions, the same wine, the same silence that enveloped him like the snow outside. "Another year," he said quietly, his deep voice rough from disuse. Mason rarely spoke aloud anymore, except on this night, December 24th, Christmas Eve. He lit the 3 candles at the center of the table and dimmed the cabin's lights. The flickering flames illuminated a framed photograph propped against one of the glasses. Eleanor, with her chestnut hair falling in waves around her shoulders, her arm wrapped around 10 years ago. Sophie, their daughter, had inherited her mother's hair, and Mason's eyes, a combination that had made strangers stop them in the street to comment on what a beautiful family they were. Past tense. Mason took his seat at the table facing the 2 empty chairs. He raised his glass. "Eleanor, Sophie, Merry Christmas." His voice broke on the last word. 3 years, and it still felt like yesterday. The phone call. The rush to the hospital, his hospital, only to find he was already too late for Eleanor. And then the desperate hours in the pediatric ICU, watching the life slowly drain from his daughter, despite everything modern medicine could do. Despite everything he could do. "I miss you both," he continued, the ritual confession tumbling out as it always did. "The cabin's the same. I finally fixed that loose step on the back porch that you always worried about, Eleanor. And Sophie, those wildflower seeds you planted by the creek before—" He swallowed hard. "They came back again this summer. Purple and yellow. Just like you wanted." The wind outside grew stronger, rattling the windows like a ghost, demanding entry. Mason took a long drink of wine, welcoming the burn in his throat. "I'm still working on the procedure," he said, glancing toward his study door. "The Reed procedure is almost there. The computer models show a 94% success rate now." He tried to smile, but it felt foreign on his face. "Remember how excited you were about it? Sophie, Daddy's going to fix all the broken hearts, you used to say." Mason closed his eyes, the memory washing over him. Sophie had been born with a complex congenital heart defect, hypoplastic left heart syndrome with additional ventricular septal defects. The odds had been against her from the start, but Mason had refused to accept the grim prognosis. He'd spent countless nights researching, consulting with colleagues around the world, and eventually performing a risky but successful series of surgeries on his own daughter. Sophie's recovery had inspired his life's work, developing a revolutionary approach to pediatric cardiac surgery that could save children with similar complex defects. The medical community had dubbed it the Reed procedure even before it was perfected, and for years Mason had been on the verge of a breakthrough that could change pediatric cardiology forever. "I'm close," he whispered to the empty chairs. "So close to making it work for other children. Your legacy, Sophie. He didn't mention how the research had consumed him in those final years, how often he'd missed family dinners and weekend trips to continue his work, how Eleanor had supported him anyway, believing in his mission even when it took him away from them. How on that final night he'd been performing emergency surgery on a senator's son while Eleanor drove Sophie to see the Christmas lights downtown. A drunk driver ran a red light. Eleanor died instantly. Sophie survived the ambulance ride only to die in the ICU, where her father had saved countless other children. The irony wasn't lost on Mason. It never would be. He reached for the wine bottle again, ready to pour a second glass, when a sound cut through the howling wind, a dull thud against the cabin's front door. Mason froze, listening. 3 years of isolation had sharpened his senses to the normal sounds of the mountain. This was something different, something human. Another thud, weaker this time, followed by what sounded like a muffled cry. Mason set down the bottle and moved cautiously toward the door. Few people knew about his cabin, and fewer still would brave this mountain during a blizzard on Christmas Eve. The nearest neighbor was 5 miles down the treacherous road, and Mason hadn't spoken to another human in nearly 2 months since his last supply run to town. He reached for the shotgun mounted above the door, another legacy from Eleanor, who had insisted they keep it for protection against mountain lions and bears. Mason had never fired it, but tonight something in his gut told him to keep it close. The third thud was barely audible. Mason unlocked the door and pulled it open, the bitter wind immediately assaulting his face with ice crystals and snow. At first he saw nothing in the swirling white darkness. Then his eyes adjusted, and he made out a shape collapsed on his porch. A human form curled protectively around a distended belly. A pregnant woman, unconscious, blood staining the snow beneath her. Mason's medical training kicked in instantly, overriding years of self-imposed isolation. He set the shotgun aside and knelt beside the woman, quickly assessing her condition. Pulse rapid but present. Breathing shallow. Body temperature dangerously low. The blood appeared to come from cuts on her hands and face, not from any major wound, or he checked quickly, not from any pregnancy complication. As he gathered her into his arms, a crack echoed through the night, a gunshot, distant but unmistakable. Mason's head snapped up, eyes scanning the darkness beyond his porch. Nothing but swirling snow and the black silhouettes of pine trees. Another shot rang out farther away this time. Without further hesitation, Mason carried the woman inside, kicking the door shut behind him. He laid her gently on the couch near the fireplace, grabbed a blanket, and covered her. The woman was in her mid-30s, with dark hair streaked with premature silver at the temples. Her face, though pale from cold and etched with lines of pain, held a quiet strength even in unconsciousness. And she was heavily pregnant, Mason estimated, at least 32 weeks, possibly more. "Can you hear me?" he asked gently, patting her cheek while checking her pupils with a penlight from his pocket. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" She stirred slightly, eyelids fluttering. Her lips, blue with cold, moved without sound. Mason hurried to his bedroom, retrieving his medical bag still fully stocked, despite years of disuse. Old habits. He returned to find the woman's eyes open, darting frantically around the room. "You're safe," Mason said, keeping his voice calm and even. The professional tone returned to him like muscle memory. "You're in a cabin on Weston Ridge. I'm a doctor. You collapsed outside my door." The woman's eyes, a striking amber color, fixed on him with surprising intensity. "They're coming," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Hide me, please." Before Mason could respond, Her eyes rolled back and she lost consciousness again. Mason worked methodically, checking her vitals, examining the cuts on her hands and face, defensive wounds his mind catalogued automatically. He found bruises in various stages of healing on her arms and shoulders, some recent, some weeks old. Domestic violence. The clinical term floated in his mind along with the protocols he'd followed hundreds of times in the ER. Document everything. Photograph the injuries. Report to authorities. But there were no authorities here. No hospital protocols. Just a storm-isolated cabin and a mysterious pregnant woman who had collapsed on his doorstep while someone fired shots in the darkness. Mason cleaned and bandaged her wounds, started an IV line with fluids from his emergency supplies, and covered her with heating blankets to safely raise her core temperature. Then he pulled a chair close to monitor her condition, his mind racing with questions. Who was she? Who was shooting in the forest? How had she found his remote cabin in a blizzard? And most pressingly, what medical care would her pregnancy need? As a cardiac surgeon, obstetrics had never been his specialty, but he'd done a rotation in medical school and had assisted in emergency deliveries twice during his residency. The thought of potentially delivering a baby here, miles from any hospital with minimal equipment and no assistance, sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the storm outside. The woman stirred again an hour later, her eyes opening with more clarity this time. She immediately tensed, trying to sit up. "Easy," Mason cautioned, gently restraining her. "You're safe. You were suffering from hypothermia and exhaustion." She stared at him, recognition gradually dawning in her eyes. "You're a doctor." "Yes, Dr. Mason Reed. You're in my cabin." Her hand moved protectively to her swollen belly. "The babies." Mason's eyebrows rose. "Babies, plural. Twins," she whispered. "Are they?" "I haven't examined them yet," Mason admitted. "I wanted to stabilize you first. With your permission, I'd like to check them now." She nodded weakly. Mason retrieved a portable ultrasound device from his medical supplies, a remnant from his research work. As he prepared the equipment, he asked, "What's your name?" She hesitated, clearly calculating the risk of sharing information. "Olivia," she finally said. "Olivia Winters." And Mason nodded, keeping his expression neutral. "How far along are you, Olivia?" 34 weeks. "And when was your last prenatal checkup?" Another pause. 3 weeks ago. "Any complications noted in your pregnancy?" Something flickered across her face. Knowledge, fear, calculation. "Yes," she said quietly. "One of the twins has a heart condition." Mason's hands paused momentarily on the ultrasound wand. What kind of heart condition? Hypoplastic left heart syndrome with ventricular septal defects. The exact condition Sophie had been born with. Mason felt a chill run through him that had nothing to do with the storm outside. He kept his face carefully neutral as he applied gel to the ultrasound wand. "This will be cold," he warned, placing the wand on her abdomen. The grainy image appeared on the small screen, and Mason adjusted the position until he could clearly see both fetuses. Twin A appeared to be developing normally, its heart beating strong and regular. Twin B. Mason focused the image, his experienced eyes immediately recognizing the abnormal heart structure. He'd seen hundreds of such scans over his career, but the similarity to Sophie's condition was uncanny. "You're right," he confirmed. "Twin B has HLHS with what appears to be multiple VSDs. The other twin looks healthy." He moved the wand carefully. "Both are in good positions, and I don't see any immediate concerns with the pregnancy itself." Olivia watched him with those intense amber eyes. "You know exactly what you're looking at." It wasn't a question. Mason turned off the ultrasound. I specialized in pediatric cardiac surgery before... He trailed off, not wanting to complete the sentence. Before you lost your family and disappeared into the mountains, Olivia finished for him. Mason's head snapped up, surprise and suspicion flooding through him. How do you know that? Olivia held his gaze steadily. I know who you are, Dr. Reed. I know about the Reed procedure and what you were working on before the accident. Mason stood abruptly, putting distance between them. Who are you? How did you find me? I was a pediatric nurse at Mercy Hospital in Denver. She explained, her voice growing stronger. I was there the day you operated on your own daughter 10 years ago. I assisted in some of your surgeries after that. Mason's mind raced back through the hundreds of nurses he'd worked with over his career trying to place her face. I looked different then, she added, as if reading his thoughts. My hair was blonde. I went by Liv. A faint memory surfaced, a young nurse with a quick mind and steady hands. She'd shown unusual interest in his research, often staying after shifts to discuss cases. Nurse Winters, he said slowly. Pediatric ICU. She nodded, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. You remember? That doesn't explain how you found my cabin, or why you're here. Mason's voice hardened. Or who was shooting in the forest. Olivia's hand moved protectively over her belly again. The man with the gun is my husband Victor. He's been tracking me since I escaped 3 weeks ago. Escaped? Her eyes darkened. Victor is not who I thought he was when we married. He's not who the world thinks he is. Mason glanced at the bruises on her arms visible beneath the loose sleeves of the thermal shirt he'd changed her into. He did this to you. It wasn't a question, but she nodded anyway. Why come here, to my cabin specifically? Mason pressed. There are shelters, hospitals, police. None of those would have protected me from Victor, Olivia interrupted. He has connections everywhere, police, hospitals, government. And once he found out about the twins' condition, she trailed off, tears forming in her eyes. Mason waited, sensing there was more to the story than she was telling. I came to you because you're the only one who might understand, she continued after composing herself. And because you're the only one who might be able to help the baby if she survives. Twinbee is a girl, the other is a boy. Olivia's eyes locked with his, intense and desperate. Dr. Reed, I know you've continued your research up here. I know the Reed procedure could save my daughter's life. Mason closed his eyes, the memory washing over him. Sophie had been born with a complex congenital heart defect, hypoplastic left heart syndrome, with additional ventricular septal defects. The odds had been against her from the start, but Mason had refused to accept the grim prognosis. When she was just 3 years old, after 2 conventional surgeries had failed to fully correct her condition, he'd spent countless nights researching, consulting with colleagues around the world, and eventually performing a risky but successful experimental procedure on his own daughter, the first version of what would later be called the Reed procedure. Sophie's recovery had inspired his life's work, developing a revolutionary approach to pediatric cardiac surgery that could save children with similar complex defects in a single operation. The medical community had dubbed it the Reed procedure, even before it was perfected, and for years Mason had been on the verge of a breakthrough that could change pediatric cardiology forever. Sophie had thrived for 5 years after the surgery, before the accident took her life. Mason felt as if the floor had tilted beneath him. How could you possibly know I've continued the research? Because Victor has been funding it. The revelation hit Mason like a physical blow. Victor Winters. The name suddenly clicked into place. Dr. Victor Winters, the renowned geneticist whose breakthrough research in genetic markers had revolutionized predictive medicine. His charitable foundation had been one of the major funders of Mason's research before the accident. "Victor kept tabs on you after you disappeared," Olivia continued. "He was fascinated by your work, obsessed with it, really. He has copies of all your research, even the updates you've sent to your old colleague, Dr. Patel." Mason's mind reeled. He had indeed maintained limited contact with Rahul Patel, sending encrypted updates on his progress with the procedure's computer models. It had been his only connection to his former life that, and the anonymous donations to the hospital's Pediatric Cardiac Research Fund he made each year on Sophie's birthday. "Why would your husband care about my research?" Mason asked, though a sickening suspicion was already forming in his gut. Olivia's face crumpled, tears flowing freely now. "Because Victor doesn't see children as people. He sees them as test subjects. Even our own son." She covered her face with her hands, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Mason weighted the pit in his stomach, growing deeper. When she composed herself, Olivia looked up with eyes red but resolute. "We had a son, Lucas. He was 6 when he died, 8 months ago." "I'm sorry," Mason said automatically, the phrase he'd uttered to countless parents over his career. The phrase he'd grown to hate when people said it to him. "Lucas was born with a rare genetic condition," Olivia continued. "Victor told me he was developing treatments using experimental gene therapy. I believed him. I trusted him. He was my husband and a brilliant scientist." Her voice hardened. "What I didn't know was that he was using Lucas for unauthorized experiments, testing genetic modifications that no ethics board would ever approve." Mason felt sick. "And these experiments killed our son." The words came out flat, emotionless. "Victor called it an unexpected reaction to the treatment. Made it look like the disease had simply progressed. But I found his research notes. I saw what he'd done." Mason stood and paced across the room, processing the horrific story. Outside, the wind howled louder, as if the storm itself was responding to Olivia's tale. "When I discovered I was pregnant with twins," she continued, "Victor was elated, especially when the tests showed one twin had a heart defect. He called it the perfect control group. One healthy baby, one with HLHS just like your daughter." The implication was clear, and it sent a wave of revulsion through Mason. "He wanted to experiment on your babies." Olivia nodded, her hand protectively covering her belly. "He said the Reed procedure would be unnecessarily invasive, that he could fix the genetic issue instead, using what he learned from Lucas." Mason stopped pacing, turning to face her. "So you ran." "I took his research data as evidence and ran," she confirmed. "I've been hiding for weeks, moving from place to place. But he always finds me." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "He has resources, connections I can't even imagine. I needed to find someone he couldn't control or intimidate. Someone with nothing left to lose," Mason concluded grimly. Olivia met his gaze unflinchingly. "Someone who would understand what it means to protect a child with a broken heart." The reference to Sophie sent a sharp pain through Mason's chest. He turned away, moving to the window, where snow continued to fall in thick, relentless sheets. The storm showed no signs of abating, which meant they were effectively trapped here, safe for the moment from Victor's pursuit, but also cut off from any help if Olivia's condition worsened. "How did you find my cabin?" he asked without turning around. "Victor had the location. I accessed his files before I left." Mason nodded slowly, pieces falling into place. The mysterious donation that had paid for the cabin's solar upgrades 2 years ago, it must have been Victor ensuring Mason had the facilities to continue his work. "The gunshots," he said, turning back to her. "Was that him?" "Probably." Olivia winced as she adjusted her position on the couch. He wouldn't risk hurting the babies, but he might have been trying to frighten me to let me know he's close. Mason checked his watch. Nearly midnight. Christmas Eve was almost over, the ritual dinner interrupted and forgotten. "You need to rest," he said, slipping back into doctor mode. "The babies, too. We'll talk more in the morning." Olivia caught his wrist as he moved to adjust her IV. "Dr. Reed, Mason, I know I'm asking the impossible. I know you came up here to escape, not to face someone else's nightmare. But please," her voice broke, "please help us. If not for me, then for my daughter." Mason looked down at her hand on his wrist, then at her face, determined, despite the fear and exhaustion. In her eyes, he saw something he recognized, the fierce, protective love of a parent willing to do anything for their child. The same love that had driven him to perform experimental surgery on Sophie. The same love that had kept him researching long after the medical community had advised him to accept limitations. "I'll help you," he said quietly. "But Olivia, I need to know everything. No more surprises." Relief washed over her face. "Thank you. I promise everything I know you'll know." Mason nodded, then prepared a sedative. "This will help you sleep. It's safe for the babies." As the medication took effect, Olivia's eyelids grew heavy. "Mason," she murmured, already half asleep. "Watch the windows. He always comes at dawn." Her words sent another chill through him, but Mason pushed the feeling aside. He checked her vitals one more time, then moved to his study, locking the door behind him. The room was a stark contrast to the rustic comfort of the main cabin. Here, technology reigned. 3 computer monitors displayed complex cardiac modeling software. A 3D printer sat in the corner next to a workbench covered with anatomical heart models. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with medical texts and journals. A server hummed quietly, storing years of research data. Mason sat at the desk and powered up the main computer. If what Olivia said was true, if Victor Winters had been monitoring his research, then there would be digital traces somewhere in his system. Mason had always been careful about security, but he'd never imagined someone would have a specific interest in hacking his isolated work. He ran several diagnostics, checking access logs and connection records. Nothing obvious appeared, but Mason knew that didn't mean his system was clean. A man with Victor's resources could employ sophisticated methods that wouldn't leave ordinary traces, but it remained theoretical. Mason had left the medical community before the procedure could move to animal trials, much less human testing. The thought of performing it on Olivia's unborn daughter sent a wave of anxiety through him. Yet, if the baby's condition was as severe as Sophie's had been, it might be her only chance. Mason rubbed his eyes, exhaustion finally catching up with him. He pulled up one more file, his personal records on Victor Winters's foundation. The donation history confirmed what Olivia had said. The foundation had been a major supporter of his research, contributing nearly $2 million over 5 years. What Mason hadn't realized was that the donations had continued after he left. Small amounts funneled through shell companies and routed to the hospital's research department, earmarked for continuation of the Reed procedure research. Victor had been keeping the project alive, possibly developing his own version based on Mason's work. The implications were disturbing. If Victor had been using Mason's research as part of his unauthorized genetic experiments, a soft noise from the main room interrupted his thoughts. Mason closed the files and moved quietly back to check on Olivia. She slept fitfully, her face troubled even in sedated rest. One hand remained protectively curved over her belly. Mason adjusted the blanket around her shoulders, then moved to the window, peering out at the storm. The snow continued to fall, but the wind had lessened slightly. First light would come in a few hours. If Victor was truly out there waiting for dawn, as Olivia had warned, they needed a plan. He checked the shotgun, confirming it was loaded, then positioned it within easy reach. Next, he inventoried his medical supplies, mentally preparing for any emergency that might arise, whether from Olivia's pregnancy or from the threat lurking in the forest. As he worked, his eyes kept returning to the abandoned dinner table where 3 glasses of wine sat untouched. The candles burned low, and the photograph of Eleanor and Sophie watched over the interrupted ritual. For the first time in 3 years, Mason's Christmas Eve had been about something other than grief. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had retreated to this mountain to escape the world and its demands, to nurse his guilt and failure in isolation. Yet here he was, drawn back into a struggle involving the very condition that had shaped his career, the condition that had taken his daughter despite his best efforts. Was it coincidence Mason didn't believe in fate or divine intervention, not after watching Sophie die under his helpless hands? But the statistical improbability of this specific woman finding him on this specific night with this specific medical condition stretched coincidence to the breaking point. He settled into a chair positioned to watch both Olivia and the windows, the shotgun across his lap. Whatever dawn brought, he would be ready. Mason hadn't prayed since Sophie died. But as the clock ticked past midnight, marking the official start of Christmas Day, he found himself whispering words that felt both foreign and familiar. "Eleanor, Sophie, if you're out there somewhere, help me get this right this time." Outside, the wind quieted to a whisper, as if the storm itself was holding its breath, waiting for morning. The night passed slowly. Mason dozed intermittently, but jerked awake at every sound, the settling of the cabin's logs, as temperature changed, the creak of tree branches heavy with snow, the occasional soft moan from Olivia as she shifted in her sleep. At 4:30 a.m., Mason rose stiffly from the chair and made coffee. The rich aroma filled the cabin, a small comfort against the tension of waiting. He checked Olivia's vitals again, stable, though her blood pressure was slightly elevated. Not unusual for a high-risk twin pregnancy, but something to monitor closely. As he was adjusting her IV, Olivia's eyes fluttered open. For a moment, confusion clouded her face. Then recognition and memory returned, bringing with them a flash of fear. "What time is it?" she asked, voice raspy from sleep. "Almost 5. Still dark." Mason held a cup of water with a straw to her lips. "How are you feeling?" She drank gratefully. "Tired, sore." Her hand moved to her belly. "The babies are active." Mason nodded. "That's good. I'd like to do another ultrasound if you're up to it." "Of course." Olivia struggled to sit up, and Mason helped position her against the arm of the couch. "Any sign of Victor?" "Nothing since the gunshots last night." Mason prepared the ultrasound equipment. "How does he usually find you?" Olivia's expression darkened. "He has resources most people can't imagine. Private security firms, contacts in law enforcement, surveillance technology, but mostly it's because he knows me, knows how I think, where I might go." Mason applied the gel to her abdomen. "Yet you've evaded him for 3 weeks." "Because I finally stopped being predictable." A hint of pride crossed her face. "I abandoned my car, left my phone, paid cash everywhere. I even changed my appearance." And she touched her silver-streaked hair, once blonde, according to her earlier comment. Mason focused the ultrasound, carefully examining both twins. "They look good," he reported. "Heart rates, normal positions, stable." He adjusted the angle to get a better view of twin B's heart defect. "The HLHS is significant, though. Has your doctor discussed surgical options after birth?" Olivia nodded, watching the screen intently. 3-stage Norwood procedure starting within the first week after birth. But the cardiologist wasn't optimistic, given the additional VSDs. Her eyes met Mason's. "That's why I needed to find you." The Reed procedure could fix everything at once. Mason turned off the ultrasound, wiping the gel from her skin with careful movements. "Olivia, you need to understand something. The Reed procedure has never been performed as currently designed. The version I used on Sophie was much more limited, and even that was considered experimental at the time." "But your computer models are promising but untested," he interrupted. "There's a vast difference between simulations and actual surgery, especially on an infant." Determination hardened her features. "Without it, what are my daughter's chances?" Mason hesitated, the doctor in him warring with the father, who remembered similar devastating statistics. "With standard treatment, given the severity I'm seeing, perhaps 40 to 50% survival to age 5. Tears filled Olivia's eyes, but she blinked them back. "And with your procedure, theoretically, if it works exactly as designed, up to 90% normal cardiac function and development." Mason sighed. "But Olivia, that's an untested theoretical outcome." "Better theoretical hope than certain tragedy," she said quietly. "I've already lost one child, Mason. I can't—" She broke off as a contraction seized her face, contorting in pain. Mason quickly checked his watch, timing the contraction. "How long have you been having these?" "On and off since yesterday," she admitted, breathing through the pain. "But they weren't regular." Mason placed his hands on her abdomen, feeling the muscle tension. "This could be Braxton Hicks contractions, false labor, common with twins, especially when the mother is under stress." "Which I definitely am," Olivia said with a weak attempt at humor as the contraction eased. "We'll monitor them," Mason said, his concern growing. "If they become regular or increase in intensity, you could be entering preterm labor. At 34 weeks, the babies would likely survive, but we're miles from any NICU equipment they might need. Not to mention a cardiac surgeon for my daughter." Olivia added the fear evident in her voice despite her attempt to stay calm. Mason checked the time again, 5:22 a.m. First light would soon break over the eastern ridge. He moved to the window, peering out at the snow-covered landscape. The storm had passed during the night, leaving behind a pristine white world glittering under a star-filled sky. Beautiful, peaceful, and exposing any tracks that might lead to the cabin. "You should eat something," he said, turning back to Olivia. "Keep your strength up. I'll make breakfast." As Mason prepared a simple meal of oatmeal and fruit, his mind raced through contingency plans. The road down the mountain would be impassable until the county plows came through, which could take days after a storm this severe. The satellite phone provided emergency contact with the outside world, but who would he call? If what Olivia said about Victor's connections was true, normal channels of help might only endanger them further. And if her contractions developed into actual labor, they would face a high-risk twin birth in an isolated cabin with minimal obstetric equipment. Mason set these worries aside temporarily, focusing on the immediate need to keep Olivia comfortable and monitor her condition. He helped her eat, checked her vitals again, and administered more fluids through the IV. As dawn approached, Olivia grew increasingly anxious, her eyes darting to the windows with each sound from outside. "He'll come at first light," she repeated. "He always does." Mason checked the shotgun again, more to reassure her than from any real expectation of using it. "Olivia, even if he's out there, the snow is at least 3 feet deep. No vehicle can reach us, and on foot." "Victor doesn't think like normal people," she interrupted. "He sees obstacles as puzzles to be solved, not barriers. If he's determined to reach us, he will." As if summoned by her words, a distant mechanical sound carried through the crisp morning air. Mason moved quickly to the window, scanning the valley below. They're moving slowly along the snow-covered service road that no civilian should have known about, was a snowcat, a specialized vehicle designed to traverse deep snow. "He's here," Olivia whispered, fear strangling her voice. "God help us, he's coming." Mason watched the vehicle's steady progress up the mountain with growing dread. The service road would bring it within a quarter-mile of the cabin, close enough for someone to approach on foot, even in deep snow. "Is Victor alone?" Mason asked, trying to formulate a plan. "Never," Olivia replied, struggling to sit up straighter. "He always has at least one security person with him. Ex-military, usually." Mason's mind raced through options. They couldn't run, not with Olivia's condition. They couldn't hide. The cabin was the only structure for miles. Fighting was equally implausible. Mason had one shotgun against what sounded like armed professionals. "The study," he said suddenly. "There's a storage cellar beneath it, accessible through a trap door under the desk. It was originally a root cellar, but I've used it for equipment storage." Hope flashed in Olivia's eyes. "Can we hide there?" "You can," Mason said, already helping her to her feet. "I'll deal with Victor." "No," terror filled her face. "You don't understand what he's capable of." "I'm beginning to," Mason said grimly. "But he doesn't know that I know about him. I'm just the reclusive Dr. Reed, to him a potential asset for his research. He won't risk harming me." Olivia clutched his arm. "And when he demands to know where I am, I'll tell him you left during the night, that I treated your hypothermia, and you took off before dawn." Mason guided her slowly toward the study, supporting most of her weight. "The snow will make tracking difficult, and I'll suggest you headed east toward the ranger station." Olivia didn't look convinced, but another contraction hit before she could argue further. This one more intense than the last, causing her to gasp and double over. Mason's concern deepened. "How far apart are they now?" "Maybe 20 minutes, she managed between breaths. Too close. If this was true labor, rather than Braxton Hicks, they had hours at most before the twins would arrive. He got her settled in the cellar, a small space, but equipped with emergency supplies, including a camping mattress, he quickly set up. He connected a fresh IV bag, checked that the oxygen tank he stored there was full, and made sure she had water and high-energy snacks within reach. "I've got monitoring equipment in here," he explained, attaching a portable fetal monitor to her abdomen. "It will alert me if anything changes with the babies. There's enough oxygen for several hours if needed." "What if the labor progresses?" Olivia asked, the fear in her eyes, now mixed with physical pain. Mason squeezed her hand. "One crisis at a time. Let me deal with Victor first." The sound of the snowcat's engine had stopped, indicating it had reached the closest approach point to the cabin. Mason estimated they had 15 minutes at most before Victor would reach them on foot. "Stay quiet, no matter what you hear," he instructed. "If something happens to me, use the satellite phone to call this number." He wrote down a sequence on a scrap of paper. "It's my colleague Rahul. Tell him everything. He'll help you." Olivia gripped his hand tightly. "Be careful. Victor doesn't see people as people, just means to an end." Mason nodded, then closed the trapdoor, sliding his heavy desk partially over it to conceal its existence. He quickly tidied the evidence of Olivia's presence from the main room, bundling the used blankets and hiding the medical supplies. The couch cushions still held the impression of her body. He flipped them, then disarranged them to look naturally lived in. He was washing the breakfast dishes when he heard footsteps on the porch, followed by a sharp, authoritative knock. Mason dried his hands slowly, took a deep breath, and opened the door. 2 men stood on his porch. The first was tall and distinguished-looking, in his early 50s, with salt and pepper hair and wire-rimmed glasses. Despite the Arctic conditions, he wore only a sleek red ski jacket over what appeared to be an expensive suit. His face held the confident, slightly impatient expression of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted. Dr. Victor Winters. Even without Olivia's description, Mason would have recognized the famous geneticist from scientific journals and TED Talk videos. The second man was younger, military straight posture, with the hyper-aware eyes of someone constantly assessing threats. He wore tactical cold-weather gear and had one hand resting casually near what Mason assumed was a concealed weapon. "Dr. Reed," Victor said, his voice smooth and cultured with just a hint of surprise. "I apologize for the intrusion, especially on Christmas morning, but I'm in need of assistance." Mason kept his expression neutral. "Not many people know where to find me, Dr. Winters." A flash of satisfaction crossed Victor's face at being recognized. "I've followed your work for years, Doctor. Your research on congenital heart defects is unparalleled." "Former research," Mason corrected. "I left that life behind." "Did you?" Victor's smile didn't reach his eyes. "My sources suggest otherwise. May we come in? It's rather cold, and my business is urgent." Mason hesitated, then stepped aside, allowing them to enter. The security man immediately began a visual sweep of the cabin, his eyes noting exits, potential weapons, and vantage points. "Your home is charming," Victor commented, removing his gloves but not his jacket. "Rustic, yet I detect certain modern amenities. Solar power, satellite, internet." "What's your business, Dr. Winters?" Mason asked, ignoring the question. "I doubt you tracked me down and braved a blizzard for casual conversation." Victor's smile tightened. "Direct. I appreciate that." He glanced at the security man, who gave a small nod after completing his scan of the visible areas. "I'm looking for my wife, Olivia Winters. She's experiencing a mental health crisis and left her treatment facility without medical clearance. In her condition, it's extremely dangerous." "Her condition?" "She's pregnant with twins," Victor explained, his face a perfect mask of concern. "High-risk pregnancy complicated by delusional episodes brought on by the recent loss of our son. She's not thinking clearly, and I'm desperately worried about her and the babies." Mason studied the man before him, impressed, despite himself, at the smooth delivery of the lies. Had he not heard Olivia's story, he might have been convinced. "I'm sorry to hear that," Mason said carefully, "but I don't see how I can help you." Victor sighed as if disappointed by Mason's obtuseness. Local hunters reported seeing a woman matching Olivia's description heading toward this area yesterday. Given the storm and your background as a doctor, I thought she might have sought help here. Mason allowed a hint of recognition to cross his face. "A pregnant woman did show up last night, nearly hypothermic. I didn't get her name. She left before dawn, heading east toward the ranger station." Victor and the security man exchanged glances. "You treated her?" Victor asked. "Basic emergency care," Mason confirmed. "Warmed her up, gave her fluids and food. She seemed physically fine if exhausted." He hesitated, then added, "She was agitated, kept talking about being followed." Victor nodded, looking relieved. "That's consistent with her condition. Did she say anything else about me, perhaps? Or about the babies?" Mason shook his head. "Just that she needed to reach the ranger station. I offered to call for help when the storm passed, but she insisted on leaving." He moved to the window, pointing east. "She headed that way across the ridge. If you hurry, you might catch up to her." Victor studied Mason's face carefully. "You're certain she's gone? See for yourself," Mason offered, opening the door to the bedroom and bathroom. "It's not a large cabin." The security man conducted another quick sweep of the newly revealed rooms, then nodded to Victor. "I notice you keep your study door locked," Victor observed casually. Mason shrugged. "Old habits. I have research materials I'd rather not risk damaging. Coffee equipment, too. I'm something of an enthusiast. Research materials, Victor's interest visibly sharpened. On the Reed procedure, perhaps, among other things. Victor stepped closer, lowering his voice conspiratorially. Dr. Reed, I've followed your work for years. The Reed procedure could revolutionize pediatric cardiac surgery. One of Olivia's twins has HLHS. Did she mention that to you? No. Mason lied. Our conversation was brief. A remarkable coincidence, wouldn't you agree? The foremost expert on this specific condition, isolated on a mountain, and my wife with her affected baby finding their way to your doorstep. Mason met Victor's gaze steadily. Life is full of coincidences, Dr. Winters. Most don't mean anything. I disagree, Victor said, his voice hardening slightly. I believe everything happens for a reason, driven by forces we can identify and control. Genetics, psychology, environmental factors. Nothing is truly random. An interesting philosophy. Victor smiled thinly. More than philosophy, Doctor. It's the future of human development. Imagine a world where genetic defects like HLHS could be corrected before birth. No invasive surgeries, no lifelong complications, just perfect health from conception. Sounds utopian, Mason said neutrally. Also, sounds like eugenics. Victor waved a dismissive hand. An outdated term with unfortunate historical baggage. I prefer genetic optimization. His eyes gleamed with the fervor Mason had seen in zealots and true believers. Your surgical approach is brilliant, but ultimately a stopgap. My research addresses the root cause. From the study barely audible came a soft thud, like someone shifting position. The security man tensed, hand moving to his weapon. Mason quickly moved toward the kitchen. More coffee. It's freshly made. Victor held up a hand, stopping both Mason and his security detail. What was that sound? Probably the roof settling, Mason said easily. The temperature change after a storm causes the logs to contract and expand. Happens all the time. Victor studied him for a long moment, then nodded to the security man, who relaxed slightly. I should continue searching for Olivia, Victor said. The ranger station, you said, that was her plan, yes. Mason moved to the door, subtly encouraging their departure. I hope you find her safely. Victor paused at the threshold. Dr. Reed, when I do locate my wife, her condition and that of the twins will require specialized care. Your care, potentially. I would compensate you extremely generously for your expertise. I'm retired, Mason said firmly. Are you? Victor glanced toward the locked study door. Yet you continue your research. Why perfect a procedure you never intend to perform? Before Mason could respond, a muffled moan of pain came from the study, unmistakably human this time. The security man drew his weapon instantly, pointing it at Mason. Victor's face transformed, the mask of concern dropping to reveal cold fury. Open the study, Dr. Reed. Now. Mason raised his hands slowly. Put the gun away. There's a pregnant woman in medical distress in there. Waving weapons around won't help anyone. Open it, Victor repeated, his voice deadly quiet. Mason moved slowly to the study door, keenly aware of the gun trained on his back. He unlocked the door, pushed it open, and stepped inside. Victor and the security man followed close behind. The room appeared empty at first glance, just the computer's bookshelves and medical equipment. Then another moan came from beneath the desk. Move the desk, Victor commanded. The security man kept his weapon trained on Mason, while Victor himself shoved the heavy desk aside, revealing the trap door beneath. Victor opened it, and Olivia's pale, pain-stricken face looked up at them. Hello, Victor, she said, her voice remarkably steady, despite the fear and pain evident in her eyes. Merry Christmas. Victor's eyes, cold and calculating, moved from Olivia's face to the fetal monitor strapped to her abdomen. His expression shifted from fury to something more unsettling clinical interest. "Contractions every 18 minutes, he noted, glancing at the readout. "Early labor. Unfortunate timing, my dear." Olivia's hands moved protectively over her belly. "Stay away from me, Victor." Mason stepped forward, positioning himself between Victor and the trapdoor. "Dr. Winters, your wife needs medical attention, not confrontation. Whatever issues exist between you can be addressed later." "Issues?" Victor's laugh was hollow. "Is that what she told you, we have issues?" He turned to the security man. "Graves, help Dr. Reed escort my wife upstairs, carefully." Mason hesitated, torn between protecting Olivia and avoiding escalation with an armed man. Reluctantly, he climbed down into the cellar and helped Olivia to her feet. She leaned heavily against him, her face contorting as another contraction began. "Breathe through it," Mason murmured, supporting her weight. "Slowly, that's it." Victor watched impassively until the contraction passed. "Fascinating, isn't it? The body's autonomic responses during childbirth, completely beyond conscious control." "Like your sociopathy," Olivia spat, her voice strained but defiant. A flash of irritation crossed Victor's face, quickly masked. "My wife is prone to emotional outbursts, Dr. Reed, a side effect of her condition." "My condition is pregnancy, not mental illness," Olivia said, as Mason helped her navigate the narrow cellar steps. "And grief for the son you killed." Victor sighed theatrically. "You see what I'm dealing with, delusional accusations. Lucas died of complications from his genetic disorder, a tragedy we both mourned." "Save the performance," Olivia said, her voice stronger as Mason guided her to the couch. "I showed doctors. Read your research notes." Mason froze, caught in the lie. He hadn't actually seen any documentation, only heard Olivia's account. Victor noticed his reaction and smiled thinly. "Did she now? And what did these alleged notes contain?" Before Mason could respond, Olivia doubled over with another contraction stronger than the previous ones. Mason immediately shifted to medical mode, checking her pulse and the fetal monitor. "These contractions are intensifying," he said, deliberately changing the subject. "We need to focus on the immediate medical situation." Victor watched with clinical detachment. "By all means, doctor, please examine my wife. I'm quite interested in your assessment of the twins' condition, particularly twin B with the cardiac defect." Mason helped Olivia lie back on the couch, then turned to Victor. "I'll need privacy for a proper examination." "Graves will step outside," Victor conceded. "I, however, will stay. Those are my children after all." Olivia's hand clutched Mason's wrist. "Don't let him near them," she whispered urgently. Victor heard her. "Such dramatic paranoia," he commented, settling into a chair with the casual ease of someone accustomed to getting his way. "Dr. Reed, I understand my wife has filled your head with fantastical accusations. Let me be transparent. Yes, I've continued funding your research discreetly. Yes, I have a professional interest in the Reed procedure. And yes, I believe genetic approaches are ultimately superior to surgical ones." He leaned forward, his voice taking on an earnest quality. "But I am not the monster Olivia describes. I'm a scientist pursuing treatments for conditions that devastate families, like the condition that claimed your daughter, despite your best efforts." The reference to Sophie sent a jolt of anger through Mason, but he kept his expression neutral as he prepared the ultrasound equipment. "My daughter has nothing to do with this situation," he said, his voice deliberately even. "On the contrary," Victor replied, "your daughter's condition inspired your life's work, a revolutionary surgical approach that could save countless children. Similarly, my son's genetic disorder inspired my research into preventative genetic therapies. We're not so different, you and I. We've both suffered loss, and we've both channeled that loss into scientific advancement. Mason applied the ultrasound gel to Olivia's abdomen, ignoring Victor's philosophical comparison. I need to check the baby's positions and heart rates. As the grainy image appeared on the screen, Mason carefully examined both twins. Twin A, the boy, remained in good position, head down and ready for birth. Twin B, the girl with the heart defect, was higher in a transverse position that could complicate delivery. Twin A appears ready for delivery, Mason reported, keeping his voice clinical. Twin B is in transverse position. That could become problematic if labor progresses rapidly. Victor moved closer, studying the ultrasound image with intense interest. And the cardiac defect. Mason adjusted the wand, focusing on Twin B's heart. Hypoplastic left heart syndrome with multiple ventricular septal defects, as previously diagnosed. The left ventricle is severely underdeveloped. A disturbing smile spread across Victor's face as he watched the malformed heart beating on the screen. Remarkable. Almost identical to your daughter's condition, isn't it? Mason ignored the question, continuing his examination. Heart rate is stable, but slightly elevated. Amniotic fluid levels normal. He turned off the ultrasound and wiped the gel from Olivia's skin. Her eyes met his, filled with fear and silent pleading. "What's your assessment, doctor?" Victor asked, returning to his chair. "Can my wife safely deliver these babies here, or do we need to transport her to a hospital?" "Her contractions are still irregular and widely spaced," Mason replied. "This could be false labor brought on by stress and exhaustion. However," he added, "given the high-risk nature of a twin pregnancy complicated by HLHS, a hospital with a NICU and pediatric cardiac capabilities would be ideal." Victor nodded thoughtfully. The nearest such facility would be Denver Memorial, over 100 miles away. With these road conditions, helicopter evacuation would be the only viable option. "I have a satellite phone," Mason said. "We can call for emergency medical transport." "An excellent suggestion," Victor agreed too readily. "Graves can coordinate with my private medical team. They're already on standby." Olivia's grip on Mason's arm tightened painfully. "No," she whispered. "Not his doctors." Victor sighed. "Olivia, be reasonable. Our children deserve the best care available." "Our son deserves to be alive," she countered, voice breaking. "But you took that from him with your experiments." The room fell silent except for the soft beeping of the fetal monitor. Victor's face hardened, the mask of concerned husband slipping momentarily to reveal something cold and calculating beneath. "Dr. Reed," Victor said finally, "would you mind if I spoke privately with my wife? Perhaps you could prepare that satellite phone call while we talk." Mason hesitated, reluctant to leave Olivia alone with Victor. "Any medical decision should include me as the attending physician." "Of course," Victor agreed smoothly. "This is merely a personal matter between husband and wife. 5 minutes, that's all I ask." "It's okay, Mason," Olivia said unexpectedly. Her eyes, though fearful, held determination. 5 minutes. Mason nodded reluctantly. "I'll be just outside the door. Call if you need me." He gave Victor a warning look. 5 minutes. He stepped onto the porch where Graves stood at attention, scanning the surrounding forest. The morning was bright and cold, the fresh snow dazzling under the winter sun. In the valley below, Mason could see the snowcat that had brought Victor and Graves up the mountain. Beyond that, the world was an endless expanse of white, beautiful, and isolating. Mason checked his watch. 4 minutes. He tried to imagine what Victor might be saying to Olivia, what strategy or manipulation the man was employing. From what he'd seen, Victor Winters was a man accustomed to control over his research, his reputation, and certainly over his wife. Men like that didn't surrender control easily, especially not when their secrets were at risk of exposure. 3 minutes. Mason moved to the window, trying to see inside without being obvious. He could make out Victor leaning close to Olivia, speaking intently. Her face was turned away, but her body language spoke of resistance. 2 minutes. Mason's hand moved to the satellite phone in his pocket. He should call for help, legitimate medical help, not Victor's private team. But who? If Victor truly had the connections, Olivia claimed, how could Mason be sure the responding medical personnel wouldn't be under his influence? 1 minute. Mason's gaze fell on the snowcat again, and a thought occurred to him. Victor and Graves had arrived in that vehicle, which meant they had the keys. If Mason could somehow secure those keys, he could transport Olivia down the mountain himself. But that would mean overpowering an armed security professional and a determined adversary. Time up. Mason opened the door without knocking and stepped back into the cabin. Victor sat in the same chair, looking composed. Olivia remained on the couch, her face pale but resolute. Something had passed between them, some threat or promise that had left its mark. "Have you reached an understanding?" Mason asked, looking between them. "We have," Victor replied smoothly. "Olivia has agreed to return home with me, where my medical team can provide appropriate care during her delivery." Mason looked to Olivia for confirmation. She met his gaze steadily. "I've agreed to nothing." Victor was explaining why I should cooperate for the children's sake. Victor's smile tightened. "My wife remains confused about what's best for her and our babies. Nevertheless, we should prepare to transport her to proper medical facilities." "And these would be," Mason pressed. "My research institute has a fully equipped medical wing," Victor explained. "State-of-the-art obstetric and pediatric cardiac capabilities, the perfect environment for Olivia's delivery and the baby's care afterward, particularly for Twin B's cardiac condition." The implication was clear. Victor wanted the baby with HLHS under his control in his facility, away from outside scrutiny. "I'd need to review the facility's capabilities before approving any transfer," Mason said carefully. "As Olivia's current physician, I have an ethical obligation to ensure she receives appropriate care." Victor's eyes narrowed. "Are you volunteering to accompany us, Dr. Reed? I thought you'd left the medical community behind." "For a patient in my care, I'll make an exception," Mason replied, holding Victor's gaze. The tension in the room thickened. Graves, who had followed Mason inside, shifted his position slightly, hand moving near his concealed weapon. Before Victor could respond, Olivia gasped, clutching her abdomen as another contraction seized her. This one visibly stronger than the previous ones, her face contorting in pain as she curled forward. Mason moved immediately to her side, timing the contraction. It lasted nearly a minute, significantly longer than the earlier ones. "How far apart now?" he asked when it finally eased. 12 minutes. Olivia managed, breathing heavily. "Maybe less. They're getting stronger." Mason checked the fetal monitor. Both twins showed elevated heart rates, though still within acceptable parameters. "This isn't false labor," he announced. "She's progressing toward active labor." Victor's expression shifted to one of controlled urgency. "Then we need to evacuate immediately. Graves, call the helicopter. Have it meet us at the clearing 2 miles south." "Wait," Mason interjected. "Moving Olivia through deep snow during active labor is extremely risky. The contractions are still far enough apart that we have time to make a more measured decision." "The decision is made," Victor said coldly. "My wife and children will receive care at my facility. The only question is whether you'll cooperate or not." Mason felt the situation slipping from his control. He needed time to think, to plan, to find a way to protect Olivia and her babies from whatever Victor had planned.
At minimum, we need to stabilize her before attempting any transport, Mason insisted. Let me administer fluids and monitor the next few contractions. If they remain adequately spaced, we can discuss evacuation options. Victor checked his watch, considering. 1 hour, he finally agreed. Use that time to stabilize her condition. Then we leave with or without your approval, Doctor. Mason nodded, hiding his relief at the temporary reprieve. I'll need my medical supplies from the study. Graves will accompany you, Victor said, the implied threat clear. Under Graves's watchful eye, Mason gathered IV supplies, medications, and monitoring equipment from his study. His mind raced, searching for options. The shotgun was no longer a viable defense, with Graves armed and alert. The satellite phone was useful only if he could call someone beyond Victor's influence. The snowcat keys remained with either Victor or Graves, out of reach for now. As Mason collected the supplies, his gaze fell on his research computer. The Reed procedure files were there, along with years of work on pediatric cardiac surgery. If Victor got hold of those files, there was no telling what he might do with the research, how he might pervert a procedure meant to save lives into something that served his genetic optimization agenda. Looking for something specific, Graves asked, noticing Mason's hesitation. Just mental inventory, Mason replied, loading the last supplies into a medical bag. Making sure I have everything Olivia might need. They returned to the main room where Olivia was experiencing another contraction. Victor stood watching her with the detached interest of a scientist observing a specimen. The contrast between his clinical observation and Olivia's obvious suffering sent a wave of disgust through Mason. 9 minutes apart now, Victor noted, as Mason began setting up an IV line. Progressing faster than expected. Mason worked efficiently, inserting the IV, checking Olivia's vital signs, and administering a mild sedative to help manage the pain and reduce stress. The baby's heart rates, Victor asked. Elevated but stable, Mason reported, checking the monitor. The contractions aren't causing distress yet. Victor nodded, then moved to the window, gazing out at the mountain landscape. Beautiful isolation, he commented. I understand why you chose this place, Dr. Reed. No distractions, no oversight, no bureaucracy to impede your work. I came here to escape, not to work, Mason corrected, adjusting Olivia's IV. Yet you continued your research, Victor observed. Why perfect a procedure you never intended to perform? The question struck uncomfortably close to the contradiction Mason had never fully resolved in his own mind. Why had he continued the research in isolation? Was it merely habit, the familiar rhythm of a lifetime's work? Or was there always some part of him that believed he might someday return, might use the procedure to save other children like Sophie? Some questions need answers, whether or not those answers are ever applied, Mason said finally. Victor turned from the window, a knowing smile playing at his lips. Intellectual curiosity. I understand completely. He glanced at his watch. 43 minutes remaining before we depart. Perhaps we could use this time productively. I'd be very interested in seeing your latest models of the Reed procedure. My research isn't for public consumption, Mason said firmly. Hardly public, Victor countered. I've funded much of it directly or indirectly, and given the condition of my daughter, he gestured toward Olivia's abdomen. I have more than academic interest. If you're genuinely concerned about your daughter's cardiac condition, there are established surgical protocols, Mason said, choosing his words carefully. Protocols with decades of clinical data behind them. You mean the Norwood approach, Victor replied, with barely disguised disdain. 3 high-risk surgeries spread over years with nearly half the patients never reaching adulthood. You and I both know that's not good enough. Mason studied Victor's face, unsettled, by how the man spoke about the procedure, not with a father's desperate hope, but with a researcher's calculated interest. No surgical approach is without risk, especially with HLHS, which is precisely why your work matters. Victor leaned forward, his voice dropping to an almost intimate tone. Your breakthrough wasn't just technical, it was conceptual. You questioned assumptions the entire field had accepted for decades. The accuracy with which Victor described Mason's thought process was disturbing. It suggested he hadn't merely read published papers, but had somehow accessed Mason's personal notes, perhaps even recordings of discussions that should have remained confidential. My approach remains theoretical, Mason countered, uncomfortable with Victor's familiarity. Victor's smile didn't reach his eyes. Theory becomes practice when someone has the courage to take the necessary step. You had that courage once with Sophie. The question is whether you still do. The mention of his daughter's name from Victor's lips felt like a violation. Mason turned away, focusing on adjusting Olivia's IV to hide his reaction. Medical ethics exist for a reason. Innovation without moral constraint isn't advancement. It's exploitation. Victor's eyes gleamed. But you've performed an earlier version, on your own daughter. Mason felt his jaw tighten. That was different. Sophie's case was unique, and even then the procedure was considered experimental. Yet you tried, Victor pressed, because conventional approaches offered insufficient hope, because you believed your innovation could succeed where traditional methods might fail. He moved closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial level. That's the essence of medical advancement, isn't it? The courage to attempt what others consider impossible. Mason recognized the manipulation for what it was, an appeal to his professional ego, his identity as a pioneering surgeon. In another lifetime, it might have worked. Before Eleanor and Sophie died, before he'd seen the cold calculation in Victor's eyes as he watched his wife suffer. Medical ethics exist for a reason, Mason replied. Innovation without moral constraint isn't advancement, it's exploitation. Something hardened in Victor's expression. Ethics evolve with capability, Doctor. What was considered unethical a century ago is standard practice today. The truly unethical choice is to withhold treatment that could save lives because of outdated moral constraints. Before Mason could respond, Olivia moaned, another contraction beginning. This one seemed especially intense, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge of the couch. Mason checked his watch. 7 minutes apart now. The labor is progressing rapidly. Victor's demeanor shifted, the philosophical debate forgotten in the face of medical urgency. Then we need to accelerate our departure plans. Graves, prepare the evacuation sled. The security man nodded and exited the cabin. Mason knew what an evacuation sled was, essentially a toboggan, designed for transporting injured persons through snow. In normal circumstances, it would be a reasonable option for moving Olivia to the snowcat. But with contractions coming every 7 minutes, jolting her through deep snow struck Mason as dangerously irresponsible. She's entering active labor, Mason protested. Moving her now significantly increases the risk to both Olivia and the babies. Leaving her here miles from proper medical facilities poses a greater risk, Victor countered, particularly for twin B with her cardiac condition. Olivia grabbed Mason's arm as the contraction peaked. "Don't let him take them," she gasped. Victor's patience visibly thinned. "Enough dramatics, Olivia. We're going to my facility where you and the babies will receive appropriate care." As the contraction eased, Olivia's grip on Mason's arm remained tight. "Mason," she said, her voice low but urgent. "The flash drive. In my sock." Mason frowned in confusion, but Victor's reaction was immediate.
He stepped forward, roughly pushing Mason aside and reaching for Olivia's leg. "Still hiding things, my dear," Victor said, his cultured voice now icy. After all this time, Mason moved to intervene, but Graves returned at that moment, the evacuation sled in his hands and his weapon visible at his waist. The implicit threat kept Mason in place as Victor removed Olivia's sock and extracted a small black flash drive that had been hidden against her ankle. "Evidence," Olivia said defiantly. "Everything he did to Lucas, his entire research program, the genetic modifications, the failed protocols, all of it." Victor examined the drive dispassionately. "Stolen proprietary research, inadmissible in any court, and meaningless without context." He pocketed the drive, then turned to Mason. "My wife's mental state has deteriorated since our son's death. She's constructed elaborate conspiracy theories to explain a tragic but natural event." "I saw the lab reports," Olivia insisted, her voice stronger now, despite her physical distress. "I saw what you injected into him, experimental gene therapies never approved for human use. I heard him screaming in your home lab." Victor's carefully maintained facade cracked slightly, a flash of genuine anger breaking through. "You saw what you wanted to see," he hissed. "Lucas was dying. Conventional treatment had failed. I was trying to save him with the only means available." "By treating him like a lab rat," Olivia challenged. "By treating him like the miracle he was." Victor's voice rose, his composure slipping further. "A child with his specific genetic markers. Do you have any idea how rare that is? How valuable to advancing treatments for thousands of other children?" The admission hung in the air, damning in its implications. Victor seemed to realize his error, quickly regaining his controlled demeanor. "Dr. Reed," he said, turning to Mason with forced calm, "as a medical researcher yourself, you understand the difficult ethical calculus of pioneering treatments. When conventional approaches fail, experimental protocols become justified, as you demonstrated with your own daughter." Mason stared at him, disgust rising like bile. "I operated on Sophie with full hospital ethics committee approval, multiple peer reviews, and informed consent from her mother. That's not comparable to secret home laboratory experiments." Victor waved a dismissive hand. "Bureaucratic distinctions. The fundamental principle is the same: a father using his expertise to save his child." "Lucas died," Olivia said flatly. "Your expertise killed him." "He was already dying," Victor snapped. "I gave him a chance, however small, and the opportunity to contribute to scientific knowledge that could save others." Mason watched the exchange with growing clarity. Victor Winters wasn't merely an ethically flexible scientist. He was a man who had convinced himself that his actions were justified, perhaps even noble, regardless of the human cost. A man who viewed his own children primarily as research subjects. A man who would likely view Olivia's twins, especially the girl with HLHS, the same way. "We need to leave now," Victor said abruptly, checking his watch. "The helicopter will be at the rendezvous point in 30 minutes. As if to underscore the urgency, Olivia cried out as another contraction began, stronger than the previous ones, her face contorting in pain. Mason checked the time, just over 6 minutes since the last contraction. The labor was progressing faster than expected for a first-time twin birth. He quickly checked the fetal monitor, noting that both twins' heart rates remained stable despite the increasing intensity of contractions. "Moving her through deep snow during active labor is dangerous," Mason reiterated. "The physical stress could accelerate labor or cause complications." "More dangerous than delivering twins in a remote cabin with one doctor and minimal equipment," Victor challenged, "particularly a twin with HLHS who will need immediate specialized cardiac care. The argument had merit, medically speaking. Under normal circumstances, Mason would advocate for hospital delivery in this situation. But these weren't normal circumstances. Victor's facility wasn't a standard hospital, and his interest in the baby with the heart defect seemed more scientific than paternal. Before Mason could respond, Olivia gripped his hand with surprising strength. "Don't let him take her," she whispered urgently. "He'll use her for experiments, like Lucas." Victor sighed theatrically. "More paranoid delusions. Dr. Reed, please prepare my wife for transport. We've wasted enough time." Mason faced a terrible choice. Medically, hospital delivery would be safer for the twins, particularly the girl with HLHS. But if Olivia was right about Victor's intentions, allowing him to take control might subject the baby to unethical experiments rather than proper care. "I'll need to do another examination before transport," Mason said, stalling for time. "Make sure the babies are positioned safely for movement." Victor checked his watch again, impatience evident. 5 minutes, no more. Mason helped Olivia lie back for the examination, positioning himself to block Victor's view. As he prepared the ultrasound, he leaned close to her. "Is there actually evidence on that drive?" He whispered, his voice barely audible. Olivia gave a slight nod. "Everything. Lab reports, videos, research protocols, enough to destroy him." Mason's mind raced. The flash drive was now in Victor's possession, but perhaps there was a way to recover it. If the evidence was as damning as Olivia claimed it could be, their best leverage against Victor. He proceeded with the ultrasound, deliberately taking his time as he examined the twins' positions. "Twin A remains in vertex position," he reported. "Twin B is still transverse, which could complicate delivery." Victor moved closer, studying the ultrasound screen. Estimated time to delivery. "Hard to predict with twins," Mason hedged. "First-time mothers typically labor for 12 to 24 hours, but with the contractions already at 6-minute intervals, we might be looking at a faster progression." "All the more reason to get her to proper facilities," Victor insisted. As Mason completed the examination, Olivia suddenly gasped, her water breaking in a rush that soaked the couch beneath her. "Membranes ruptured." Mason announced the situation, becoming increasingly urgent. "We need to check cervical dilation." Victor stepped back momentarily, disconcerted by the medical reality. "Do so quickly. We're leaving in 3 minutes." Mason positioned himself to block Victor's view and performed a quick examination. 4 centimeters dilated, he told Olivia quietly. "Active labor, but not yet transitional." Olivia nodded, understanding the implications. They might have a few hours yet before delivery, or the labor could accelerate rapidly, especially with twins. "Graves," Victor called, "bring the evacuation sled inside. We're moving her now." The security man complied, bringing the sled and positioning it beside the couch. Together, he and Mason carefully transferred Olivia onto the reinforced fabric, securing her with the attached straps. "I'll administer a mild sedative to help with the transport," Mason said, preparing a syringe. Victor nodded impatiently. "Whatever is necessary to expedite our departure." Mason injected the medication into Olivia's IV, then leaned close, ostensibly adjusting the straps. "Trust me," he whispered. "I won't let him take her." Olivia's eyes, though clouded with pain, and now the sedative showed understanding. As Graves and Mason prepared to move, Olivia Victor retrieved his coat and gloves. "I'll lead the way to the snowcat," he announced. "Graves, you and Dr. Reed will manage the sled. Once we reach the vehicle, we'll proceed directly to the helicopter rendezvous point." Mason nodded compliance, his mind furiously searching for opportunities. The moment they left the cabin, their options would narrow significantly. Victor clearly had resources waiting the helicopter, presumably staffed with his own people. Once Olivia was aboard that aircraft, Mason would lose any ability to protect her or the twins. The sedative was taking effect. Olivia's eyelids fluttered as she fought to stay conscious. Mason adjusted the fetal monitor to continue functioning during transport, ensuring they could track the twins' conditions. "We should bring emergency delivery supplies," Mason suggested, stalling further, "in case labor progresses during transport." Victor looked annoyed but nodded. "Quickly!" Mason gathered essential supplies into a medical bag, deliberately including items that might prove useful beyond their medical purpose: scalpels, scissors, hemostats that could function as impromptu tools if needed. As he worked, Mason's gaze fell on the satellite phone charging on his desk. With Victor and Graves momentarily distracted with Olivia, he slipped the phone into his pocket, along with a small roll of surgical tape. "Ready," he announced, returning to the main room with the medical bag. Victor opened the cabin door, revealing the brilliant white landscape outside. The storm had passed completely, leaving behind a pristine winter scene under a clear blue sky. In any other circumstance, it would have been breathtaking. "I'll break trail," Victor said, stepping out into the knee-deep snow. "Follow exactly in my footsteps to ease your passage." Mason and Graves carefully maneuvered the evacuation sled through the doorway. Olivia moaned as they jostled her, another contraction beginning despite the sedative. "Contraction," Mason announced, setting down his end of the sled. "We need to wait until it passes." Victor turned back impatiently. "We don't have time for this, Doctor. The helicopter is waiting." "Moving her during a contraction risks complications," Mason insisted. 30 seconds. Grudgingly, Victor waited as Olivia endured the contraction, her face contorted in pain despite the medication. Mason timed it nearly 70 seconds long and intensifying. The labor was progressing more rapidly than he'd anticipated. When the contraction finally eased, they continued their slow progress through the deep snow. Victor led the way, breaking a trail toward the forest edge, where the service road lay a quarter-mile away. Mason and Graves followed with the sled, the security man taking the front, while Mason handled the rear. The going was difficult. Each step required pushing through snow that reached above their knees in places. The sled, despite its design for snow travel, frequently bogged down, requiring extra effort to extract it. Mason deliberately moved cautiously, ostensibly to avoid jarring Olivia, but actually to buy more time. They had progressed perhaps 100 yards from the cabin when Olivia experienced another contraction. Mason called another halt, noting with concern that barely 5 minutes had passed since the last one. "Labor is accelerating," he warned. "We need to consider the possibility that delivery may occur before we reach your facility, Dr. Winters." Victor's expression darkened. "Unacceptable. The female twin requires specialized equipment immediately after birth." "I'm simply stating medical reality," Mason replied. "Twin births are unpredictable, and Olivia's labor is progressing faster than expected." Olivia moaned partly from pain and partly from fear. The sedative had left her groggy, but still conscious aware of their precarious situation. As they resumed their slow progress, Mason observed Victor carefully. The man moved with purpose, but showed signs of physical strain. His breathing labored his pace, slowing incrementally. Unlike Mason, who spent his days chopping wood and maintaining the cabin, Victor's fitness appeared to be that of someone accustomed to laboratories and offices, not wilderness trekking. Graves, on the other hand, moved with the efficient economy of someone with military training. His eyes constantly scanned their surroundings, alert to potential threats, despite the apparent emptiness of the snow-covered forest. The gun at his waist remained visible, a constant reminder of the power dynamic. They had covered perhaps half the distance to the service road when Olivia cried out a sharper, more urgent sound than before.
Mason immediately called another halt. "What now?" Victor demanded, turning back with visible frustration. Mason knelt beside the sled, checking the fetal monitor. "Twin B's heart rate is showing decelerations during contractions," he reported. "That could indicate stress." Victor's expression shifted from annoyance to concern. "How severe?" "Moderate for now, but concerning given the underlying cardiac condition," Mason explained. "We should reassess our approach." Victor hesitated, visibly calculating risks and options. "The helicopter has advanced medical equipment. The sooner we reach it, the better. If the baby's condition deteriorates during transit, we might not have time to intervene," Mason countered. "The safer option would be to return to the cabin where I have more supplies and a stable environment." Victor's jaw tightened. "And deliver the babies in a remote cabin with minimal equipment. That's your medical recommendation, Doctor?" "Given the circumstances, yes," Mason said firmly. "Continuing this difficult transport is placing additional stress on both Olivia and the babies. The risks now outweigh the benefits." Victor stared at Mason for a long moment, suspicion clear in his eyes. Then he turned to Graves. "Your assessment." The security man surveyed their position, the difficult terrain ahead, and Olivia's obvious distress. "The doctor may be right, sir. This is slow going, and we're still 20 minutes from the snowcat at best. The helicopter rendezvous is another 15 minutes beyond that." Frustration flashed across Victor's face, followed by reluctant acceptance. "Very well." We returned to the cabin. "But Doctor—" His voice hardened. "Understand that this decision places full responsibility for my wife and children's well-being on your shoulders." "I accept that responsibility," Mason replied evenly. They carefully turned the sled around and began retracing their steps toward the cabin. The return journey proved slightly easier following the path they'd already broken through the snow. Still, it was nearly 15 minutes before they reached the cabin's porch. During that time, Olivia experienced 2 more contractions, each stronger than the last. The twin with HLHS continued to show concerning decelerations in heart rate during contractions, though the patterns normalized between them. Once inside, they transferred Olivia back to the couch. Mason immediately performed another examination. 6 centimeters dilated, he announced. "Progressing rapidly now. Twin A remains in good position for delivery." Victor paced the small cabin, clearly agitated. "This is not how this was supposed to proceed," he muttered, more to himself than to them. "Birth rarely follows our plans," Mason replied, preparing additional medical supplies. "We need to focus on supporting Olivia through the process and ensuring both babies receive appropriate care upon delivery." Victor stopped pacing, fixing Mason with a calculating stare. "And what exactly is your plan for Twin B's cardiac condition? Without surgical intervention, her prognosis is poor." "My immediate concern is safe delivery," Mason said. "Once both twins are stable, we can discuss further medical options." Victor's laugh was cold and humorless. "Discussion time is past, Doctor. That child will need immediate intervention to survive. The Reed procedure is her best chance." The statement hung in the air between them. Mason stared at Victor, trying to gauge his intent. "The Reed procedure has never been performed on a newborn," Mason said carefully. "It remains theoretical." "Yet you've refined it for years," Victor countered. "Your computer models show exceptional success rates, and you performed an earlier version on your own daughter." "Under completely different circumstances," Mason insisted. "In a hospital setting with a full surgical team and appropriate equipment." Victor leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Dr. Reed, let's be frank. You've continued developing this procedure in isolation for 3 years. Why? Because somewhere in that brilliant mind of yours, You believed it might someday save another child like Sophie. The word struck uncomfortably close to a truth Mason had never fully acknowledged to himself. Today, that someday has arrived, Victor continued. My daughter has the exact condition your procedure was designed to address. You have the knowledge and skills to save her life.
Will you really withhold treatment based on technicalities about proper facilities? Before Mason could respond, Olivia cried out as another powerful contraction seized her. This one visibly more intense than previous ones, her body curling forward despite the restraints still securing her to the sled. Mason quickly checked the fetal monitor. Twin B's heart rate is dropping significantly during contractions now. He reported professional concern overriding the tension with Victor. We need to prepare for imminent delivery and possible neonatal cardiac distress. Victor's demeanor shifted instantly from philosophical debate to urgent action. What do you need? Everything from my study, the emergency medical supplies in the cabinet behind the desk, the neonatal resuscitation kit, and the specialized cardiac equipment in the locked case, Mason directed. Graves can help you carry it. As Victor and Graves hurried to the study, Mason leaned close to Olivia, who was breathing heavily as the contraction eased. Listen carefully, he whispered urgently. I have the satellite phone. When the babies come, there will be momentary confusion. That's our window. I'll contact my colleague Rahul. He can send legitimate medical help. Olivia nodded weakly, her face pale with exhaustion and fear. Don't let him take her, she pleaded again. I won't, Mason promised. But I need you to be strong for a little longer. The delivery will happen soon, and I'll need you fully present for it. He quickly administered fluids through her IV to combat dehydration from the exertion and labor, then prepared the limited obstetric equipment he had available. The cabin's main room would become an impromptu delivery suite, far from ideal, but workable given the circumstances. Victor and Graves returned with the requested supplies, setting them up according to Mason's directions. Despite his ethical concerns about Victor, Mason had to acknowledge that the man moved with the efficiency of someone familiar with medical procedures. He organized medications, monitored readings, and prepared equipment with practiced ease. You have medical training, Mason observed as they worked. MD PhD, Victor confirmed without looking up from the equipment he was arranging. I practiced briefly before focusing on research. Genetics was always my primary interest, but clinical knowledge proved useful. This new information added another layer to Mason's understanding of Victor. Not just a scientist with questionable ethics, but a doctor who had abandoned the central tenet of the profession, first do no harm. Olivia's contractions continued to intensify, coming barely 3 minutes apart now. Mason performed another examination and found her fully dilated. We're entering the final stage, he announced. Delivery is imminent. Victor positioned himself near the medical equipment, his expression intense and focused. And the cardiac twin, still showing decelerations during contractions but recovering between them, Mason reported helping Olivia into a better position for delivery. We'll need to be prepared for immediate intervention after birth. The next contraction brought an overwhelming urge to push. Olivia cried out, her body instinctively responding to the biological imperative. That's it, Mason encouraged. Work with the contractions, Olivia. Twin A is almost here. The delivery proceeded with unexpected speed, Olivia's body seemingly determined to bring these babies into the world despite the less-than-ideal circumstances. With just a few powerful pushes, Twin A emerged a robust baby boy with a lusty cry that filled the cabin. He's here, Mason announced quickly, clearing the baby's airways and placing him on Olivia's chest for a brief moment of contact. Healthy lungs, good color. Tears streamed down Olivia's face as she touched her son for the first time. "Lucas," she whispered, naming him after the child she had lost. The moment was brief. Mason needed to clamp and cut the umbilical cord, then prepare for the delivery of Twin B, the girl with HLHS, whose arrival would bring a new set of urgent medical challenges. Victor moved closer, his attention fixed not on the healthy boy, but on the monitors showing Twin B's heart rate, which had become increasingly erratic during the delivery of her brother. "She's in distress," he noted, his tone clinical rather than paternal. "We need to expedite the second delivery." Mason handed the baby boy to Graves, who looked surprisingly comfortable holding the newborn. Perhaps he had children of his own. "Keep him warm and continue to monitor his breathing," Mason instructed before turning his attention back to Olivia. "The second baby is coming. Her position has shifted, which is good news, but her heart rate indicates stress. We need to move quickly, but carefully." Olivia nodded, summoning her remaining strength for this final crucial effort. The contractions resumed after a brief pause, her body working to deliver the second twin. Twin B's delivery proved more complicated. The baby was smaller than her brother and in a more challenging position. Mason worked with steady, practiced movements, guiding the delivery while constantly monitoring the baby's heart rate. When she finally emerged, the contrast with her brother was immediately apparent. Where he had been pink and vigorous, she was pale and quiet. No spontaneous cry announced her arrival. Mason moved with urgent precision, clearing her airways, providing gentle stimulation, and preparing to initiate more aggressive resuscitation if needed. To his profound relief, the baby gave a weak cry, her tiny chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. "She's breathing," he announced quickly, clamping and cutting the cord. "But her cardiac function is compromised as expected with HLHS. We need to stabilize her immediately." Victor was already at the neonatal station they'd prepared, arranging medications and monitoring equipment. His movements were precise, his focus absolute. Whatever his moral failings in this moment, he was functioning as a medical professional. Mason carefully transferred the baby girl to the warming station, attaching monitoring leads to her tiny chest and initiating oxygen support. Her heart, structurally deficient from birth, struggled to pump blood effectively through her small body. Without intervention, she would deteriorate rapidly. "Starting prostaglandin E1 to maintain ductal patency," Mason stated, administering the critical medication that would keep open a vital blood vessel normally present only in fetal circulation. For babies with HLHS, this connection was essential for survival until surgical correction. Victor watched every movement, occasionally suggesting modifications to the treatment protocol, many of which were actually sound medical advice. The juxtaposition was jarring, a man Mason now knew to be capable of experimenting on his own son, yet demonstrating genuine medical expertise that might help save his daughter. As they worked to stabilize the baby girl, Olivia delivered the placentas under Graves's awkward but well-meaning assistance. The security man had set the baby boy back on his mother's chest, where the infant had begun nursing instinctively. "Eleanor," Olivia said softly, looking toward her daughter. "Her name is Eleanor." The name, identical to Mason's late wife's, sent a shock through him, momentarily breaking his clinical focus. "It's not a coincidence," Olivia said, noticing his reaction. "When I researched your work, I learned about Eleanor, about how she supported you through everything, believed in your mission, even when it took you away from her. My daughter deserves a name that represents that kind of strength and faith. A name that connects her to the person who made her survival possible." Mason felt his throat tighten with unexpected emotion. The gesture was both painful and profoundly touching, a bridge between his past and this unexpected present. "Eleanor needs specialized cardiac care," Victor stated, returning to the previous argument, as if the births were merely a brief interruption.
The Reed procedure is her best option. She needs to be stabilized first, Mason countered, adjusting the oxygen flow to the tiny infant. Once her condition is stable, we can transport her to a proper cardiac center. And waste precious hours, Victor challenged. Every moment increases the strain on her heart. The Reed procedure could correct the defect immediately and permanently. In a proper surgical suite with a full team, perhaps, Mason said. Not in a cabin with improvised equipment. Victor's eyes gleamed with an unsettling intensity. You underestimate yourself, Doctor, and you underestimate what I've brought with us. He turned to Graves. The special equipment case from the Snowcat. Bring it now. The security man hesitated, looking at Olivia and the nursing infant. Sir, the snow. Now, Graves, Victor snapped. With obvious reluctance, Graves placed the baby boy securely beside Olivia and headed out into the snow. Once he was gone, Victor turned back to Mason, his voice lower and more urgent. Your procedure can save her. I've studied every aspect of it. I've even prepared specialized equipment based on your published and unpublished research. Mason continued monitoring baby Eleanor, whose condition had stabilized but remained precarious. Even if that's true, performing experimental cardiac surgery in these conditions would be recklessly dangerous. More dangerous than waiting, Victor countered. Without intervention, her chances diminish by the hour. The medical reality was uncomfortably aligned with Victor's argument. Eleanor's HLHS was severe. The prostaglandin would keep her alive temporarily, but she needed definitive surgical intervention, traditionally the first stage of the Norwood procedure performed within days of birth. The Reed procedure, if it worked as designed, could potentially correct her defect in a single operation rather than the three-staged surgeries of the Norwood approach. But it remained theoretical, untested in its current form. Mason looked at the tiny infant, her skin still slightly blue, despite the oxygen support, her heart visibly struggling with each beat displayed on the monitor. Then at Olivia, exhausted from delivery, but watching them with desperate hope in her eyes. Then at Lucas, healthy and oblivious to his sister's precarious condition. The parallel to his own situation years ago was impossible to ignore. Sophie had been born with the same condition. He had faced the same terrible choices, the same desperate search for options beyond the grim statistics of conventional treatments. Even if I considered it, Mason said carefully, we don't have the necessary equipment or support staff. You'd be surprised, Victor replied. I've prepared for this possibility since learning of the twins' condition. Before Mason could respond, Graves returned, struggling through the door with a large metal case reminiscent of military medical equipment. He set it down with a grunt, then stepped back as Victor moved forward eagerly. Specialized pediatric cardiac surgical equipment, Victor announced, opening the case to reveal an impressive array of instruments, monitoring devices, and support systems, designed specifically for the Reed procedure based on your published specifications. Mason stared at the equipment in disbelief. The case contained not just standard surgical instruments, but specialized tools he had designed himself for the procedure, tools that existed only in his papers and private research. How did you— I told you I've followed your work closely, Victor interrupted, and I have resources beyond what you might imagine. Everything needed for the procedure is here. Specialized grafts, miniaturized instruments, monitoring equipment. The thoroughness of the preparation was both impressive and disturbing. Victor had clearly been planning this for months, perhaps, since first learning of the twins' cardiac condition. This still doesn't solve the problem of surgical support, Mason pointed out. The procedure requires at least one surgical assistant and an anesthesiologist. I can assist, Victor said immediately. My medical training included surgical rotations. and Graves has paramedic certification with advanced airway management. Mason looked at the security man in surprise. Graves nodded confirmation but looked distinctly uncomfortable. This is insanity, Mason said, shaking his head. Even with this equipment, performing experimental cardiac surgery in a cabin with minimal support on a newborn, the risk is unconscionable. And what's the risk of not performing it? Victor challenged. You know the statistics better than anyone. Without intervention, Eleanor has days, perhaps weeks. Even with conventional treatment, her chances are poor. Mason turned back to the infant whose vitals had stabilized but remained concerning. The prostaglandin was working for now, maintaining critical blood flow. But Victor was right about one thing: time was against them. The medication was a temporary bridge, not a solution. Mason, Olivia called weakly from the couch, her voice thick with exhaustion but determined. What are her chances, truly? Mason met her gaze, unwilling to sugarcoat the reality. With conventional treatment, given the severity of her condition, perhaps 40–50% survival to age 5, with the Reed procedure theoretically up to 90%, but that's based on computer models, not clinical trials. And if we wait for transport to a hospital, the delay increases risk, Mason acknowledged reluctantly, especially in her compromised state. Olivia closed her eyes briefly, then looked at him with newfound resolve. I trust you, Mason. Not him, she glanced at Victor, but you. If you believe the procedure could save her, then do it. The weight of that trust settled on Mason like a physical burden. The parallels to Sophie's case were overwhelming. Another parent looking to him for a miracle, another tiny heart that conventional medicine had limited answers for. But there was a crucial difference. When he had performed the experimental procedure on Sophie, it had been in a hospital with a full surgical team after extensive preparation and ethics committee approval. This would be a desperate gamble in wilderness conditions. The helicopter will be waiting. Victor pressed, sensing Mason's indecision. Once the procedure is complete, we can transport Eleanor to a proper facility for recovery and follow-up care. Mason looked again at the surgical equipment Victor had brought. It was impressive, exactly what he would have specified for the procedure. The coincidence stretched credulity, suggesting that Victor had indeed been monitoring his research closely and preparing for this exact scenario. If, and I stress if I were to consider this, Mason said slowly, I would need absolute control of the procedure and all post-operative care decisions. No interference, no adjustments to the protocol. Victor smiled thinly. Of course, I recognize your expertise, Doctor. I merely wish to save my daughter's life using the most advanced technique available. Mason didn't believe him for a moment. Victor's interest in Eleanor went beyond paternal concern. She represented a unique research opportunity, a chance to study the outcomes of the Reed procedure firsthand. But that didn't change the medical reality. Eleanor needed intervention, and soon. The Reed procedure, despite its untested status, offered her best chance at a normal life. The question was whether Mason was willing to attempt it under these far from ideal conditions. He thought of Sophie, of the years of research he'd conducted after her successful surgery, refining and improving the procedure she had pioneered. He thought of the countless children who might benefit if the technique proved successful. And he thought of Eleanor, newly born into a world that had already dealt her a difficult hand, a serious cardiac defect, and a father whose interests seemed more scientific than loving. I'll examine the equipment, Mason decided. If and only if I determine we have everything necessary for the procedure, I'll consider performing it. But I make no promises. Victor nodded, clearly satisfied with this preliminary victory. Examine whatever you wish, Doctor.
I believe you'll find everything in order." As Mason began inspecting the surgical equipment, his mind was already racing ahead, considering not just the procedure itself, but the larger situation. If he agreed to perform the surgery, it would give them time in which Olivia could recover from delivery time, in which Mason might find a way to contact outside help, using the satellite phone still hidden in his pocket. And if the procedure succeeded, if Eleanor's heart was repaired, using the technique he'd spent years perfecting, it would validate his life's work in the most meaningful way possible. The choice before him was impossible risk performing experimental surgery under dangerous conditions, or risk losing Eleanor to delay and conventional treatments with poor outcomes. As a doctor, as a researcher, and as a father who had once faced similar impossible choices, Mason knew what his answer would be. The Reed procedure would have its first true test, not in the controlled environment of a hospital, but in a cabin on a snow-covered mountain with a newborn's life hanging in the balance. The question that remained was whether this desperate gamble would save Eleanor's life, or simply play into Victor's disturbing plans for his daughter's future. Mason methodically inspected the surgical equipment Victor had provided his trained surgeon's hands, moving with muscle memory across instruments he hadn't touched in 3 years. The case contained an impressive array of specialized tools, microsurgical instruments designed for delicate neonatal cardiac procedures, a miniaturized heart-lung bypass machine, specialized grafting materials, and monitoring equipment sophisticated enough for a major hospital. "This is hospital-grade equipment," Mason observed, unable to hide his professional appreciation despite his suspicions about Victor's motives. "Some of it appears custom-made specifically for the Reed procedure." "As I said," Victor replied with a thin smile, "I've prepared thoroughly." Too thoroughly, Mason thought. The level of preparation suggested not just paternal concern, but an almost obsessive interest in the procedure itself. The specialized tools matched specifications Mason had outlined only in his private research notes, research that should have been inaccessible to Victor or anyone else. Meanwhile, baby Eleanor's condition remained precarious. The prostaglandin was maintaining critical blood flow through her ductus arteriosus, a fetal blood vessel that normally closes shortly after birth. In babies with HLHS, keeping this vessel open was essential for survival until surgical intervention. But it was a temporary measure at best. Mason continued his examination of the surgical supplies, mentally cataloging what was available against what would be needed for the procedure. Everything essential was present, along with backup equipment and supplies he wouldn't have expected outside a specialized pediatric cardiac center. "Where did you get these specialized grafts?" Mason asked, examining the biocompatible materials designed for reconstructing the hypoplastic left ventricle. "These are experimental, not commercially available." "I have connections in medical research and development," Victor answered vaguely. "Cost was no object where my daughter's life is concerned." From the couch where she rested with baby Lucas, Olivia watched them with exhausted but vigilant eyes. "Mason," she called softly, "what are you thinking?" Mason met her gaze, weighing his words carefully. "The equipment is remarkably complete. Better than I would have expected possible outside a hospital setting." He glanced at Eleanor, whose tiny chest rose and fell with shallow breaths beneath the oxygen support. "Her condition is stabilizing with the medications, but it's temporary. She needs definitive intervention." "The Reed procedure," Victor pressed. "Potentially," Mason acknowledged reluctantly, "but the risks of performing it here even with this equipment remain significant." Victor moved closer to the infant warming station where Eleanor lay. "What's the alternative? Doctor, wait for a helicopter that may or may not reach us in this weather. Transport her for hours to a facility that will likely perform an inferior procedure with worse outcomes." Mason knew the statistics all too well. The standard Norwood procedure carried significant mortality risk up to 25% for the first stage alone. Even with successful surgery, children with HLHS faced multiple operations and lifelong cardiac issues. The Reed procedure, if it worked as designed, could potentially correct the defect in a single operation with better long-term outcomes. If it worked as designed. The phrase echoed in Mason's mind. The procedure had never been performed in its current form on a human patient. His modified version had saved Sophie years ago, but this refined approach remained theoretical, validated only by computer models and laboratory testing. "I need to speak with Olivia alone," Mason said finally. "This decision ultimately rests with her as Eleanor's mother." Victor's jaw tightened, but he nodded curtly. "Of course. 5 minutes." He gestured to Graves, and both men stepped onto the porch, closing the door behind them. The moment they were alone, Mason moved quickly to Olivia's side, keeping his voice low. "Listen carefully. The satellite phone is in my pocket. I need to contact my colleague Rahul. He can send legitimate medical help." Olivia clutched his arm. "Is there time, Eleanor?" "She's stable for now," Mason assured her. "The medications will maintain her condition temporarily. But you need to understand something. Victor's interest in the Reed procedure goes beyond saving Eleanor. The level of preparation, the specialized equipment, he's been planning this for months." "I know," Olivia whispered, tears filling her eyes. "Just like with Lucas. He sees her as a research subject first, a daughter second." Her voice hardened. "But unlike with Lucas, this time I'm aware of what he's doing. And I have you." Mason nodded grimly. "I'm going to attempt to call Rahul now while they're outside. Keep an eye on the door." He moved to the window, positioning himself to watch both Victor and Graves on the porch, while extracting the satellite phone from his pocket. The connection was painfully slow, to establish the satellite signal weak in the mountain terrain. When it finally connected, Mason spoke rapidly into the phone, explaining the situation to his former colleague in terse medical terminology. "Rahul, listen carefully," Mason said urgently. "Victor had a flash drive with evidence, research logs, video footage, everything documenting his unauthorized experiments on his son Lucas. He took it from Olivia, but I need you to tell the authorities. There's enough to warrant an investigation: illegal genetic experimentation, falsified death records, medical ethics violations. He's planning the same for his newborn daughter." He described the key details Olivia had shared about the evidence, including dates, specific procedures, and where authorities might find corroborating records. Rahul's shock was evident even through the staticky connection. "I'm sending everything now," Rahul confirmed. "I have contacts at the FBI who specialize in medical research fraud. They've been gathering intelligence on several private research facilities with questionable protocols. Victor's name has come up before." "They'll send help," Mason told Olivia as he ended the call. "A medical helicopter with a specialized pediatric cardiac team. Rahul's alerting the authorities about Victor as well. He's documenting everything we've discussed about the evidence." "How long?" Olivia asked, her eyes darting to Eleanor's monitoring equipment. 3 hours minimum, given the weather and location, Mason admitted grimly. "Possibly longer." Olivia's face fell. "Will Eleanor—" The question hung unfinished between them. Mason checked the monitors again, his professional assessment warring with his desire to offer hope. "The prostaglandin will maintain her condition for now," he said carefully. "But she needs surgical intervention soon. Hours matter with HLHS." Olivia closed her eyes briefly, then looked at him with renewed determination. "If you performed the procedure, would it help her, truly?" Mason hesitated. "Theoretically, yes. The Reed procedure could correct her defect permanently in a single operation. But Olivia, it's never been performed in its current form. The risks are significant, especially in these conditions."
And if we wait for the helicopter, we'd be gambling that her condition remains stable during transport to a hospital where she'd likely undergo the first stage of the Norwood procedure, a less comprehensive approach with higher long-term risks. Olivia looked down at Lucas, sleeping peacefully in her arms, then at Eleanor in her warming station. Do you believe in your procedure, Mason? Not just as a doctor, but as a father who once faced this same choice. The question pierced through Mason's professional detachment, touching the core of his identity as both a surgeon and a father. He had developed the Reed procedure precisely because he believed there had to be a better option for children like Sophie, like Eleanor. Yes, he admitted quietly, I believe in it, but then do it. Olivia interrupted, her voice gaining strength. Save her, Mason, not for Victor's research, but because she deserves a chance at a normal life. Before Mason could respond, the cabin door opened and Victor re-entered with Graves close behind. Mason quickly pocketed the satellite phone, turning to face them. Well, Doctor, Victor asked expectantly, have you reached a decision? Mason exchanged a final glance with Olivia, who gave a slight nod. I'll perform the procedure, Mason announced. But with conditions. I have complete control. You assist only as directed without deviation from my instructions, and all post-operative care decisions are mine alone. Victor's eyes gleamed with triumph, poorly disguised as relief. Of course, Doctor. Whatever is best for Eleanor. Graves will need to assist as well, Mason continued. You mentioned he has paramedic training with advanced airway management. The security man nodded, looking decidedly uncomfortable. 4 years as a combat medic, sir. Good. We'll need those skills. Mason turned to Olivia. The procedure will take several hours. You should rest and recover from the delivery. Graves can help monitor Lucas while assisting us. Olivia reached for Mason's hand, gripping it tightly. Save her, she whispered again. Mason nodded once, then turned to the medical equipment with renewed purpose. We'll convert the study into an operating room. It has the cleanest environment and most stable temperature. Victor helped me move the necessary equipment. Graves prepare the warming station for transport and continue monitoring Eleanor's condition. As they work to transform the small study into a makeshift cardiac surgical suite, Mason felt a familiar focus descending over him, the calm, methodical concentration that had defined his years as a surgeon. His hands moved with precision, arranging instruments, checking medications, preparing the tiny heart-lung bypass machine that would maintain Eleanor's circulation during the critical portions of the procedure. The study desk became an operating table, its surface covered with sterile drapes. The computer monitors were pushed aside to make room for the surgical equipment and anesthesia set up. Mason rigged a series of surgical lights using high-powered LED lamps from his emergency supplies, positioning them to provide optimal illumination of the tiny surgical field. Throughout the preparations, Victor remained close, his eyes constantly tracking Mason's movements. His knowledge of surgical protocols was evident. He anticipated needs, prepared equipment correctly, and demonstrated familiarity with the specialized cardiac instruments. It was increasingly clear that his medical background was more substantial than he had initially implied. "You've done cardiac surgery before," Mason observed as Victor prepared the bypass circuit with practiced efficiency. "Cardiothoracic rotation during residency," Victor confirmed without looking up. "Before I specialized in genetics and research." "Yet you abandoned clinical practice entirely." Victor's hands paused briefly. "I discovered I could help more patients through research than through individual surgeries. One surgeon can operate on perhaps 2,000 patients in a lifetime. One breakthrough in genetic therapy could help millions. If applied ethically," Mason added pointedly,
Victor's expression hardened momentarily before smoothing into professional neutrality.
Ethics evolve with capabilities, Doctor. What seems radical today becomes standard practice tomorrow. Mason chose not to pursue the philosophical debate. Eleanor's condition required his complete focus, and antagonizing Victor before the procedure would only increase the risks. When the preparations were complete, Mason performed a final check of Eleanor's condition. The medications had maintained her stability, but her oxygen saturation levels were gradually declining despite supplementation, a sign that the temporary measures were becoming insufficient. "It's time," he announced. "Graves, bring Eleanor to the operating area. Victor, final check on the bypass circuit." As they transferred the tiny infant to the makeshift operating table, Mason felt the weight of responsibility settling over him like a physical presence. Not since Sophie's surgery had he attempted a procedure with such personal significance. The parallel was inescapable. Another child with the same condition that had threatened his daughter's life. Another desperate chance at saving her through innovative surgery. Administering anesthesia, Mason stated carefully, delivering medication appropriate for Eleanor's weight and condition. Graves, monitor her vitals and assist with intubation. The security man proved surprisingly competent, his combat medical training evident in his calm efficiency under pressure. Together, they stabilized Eleanor's airway and connected her to the ventilator Mason had modified for neonatal use. "Beginning surgical approach," Mason announced, making the initial incision with a steady hand. Despite 3 years away from surgery, his muscle memory remained intact, his movements precise and confident. Victor stood opposite him, functioning as surgical assistant. His eyes never left Mason's hands as they worked, his attention focused with an intensity that went beyond professional interest. This was the culmination of months, perhaps years of planning, watching the Reed procedure performed by its creator on a patient with the exact condition it was designed to address. The initial stages proceeded smoothly. Mason exposed Eleanor's tiny heart, the anatomical defect immediately apparent to his experienced eye. The left ventricle was severely underdeveloped, just as the prenatal ultrasounds had indicated. The ventricular septal defects holes between the heart chambers were also visible. Preparing for bypass. Mason stated, his voice calm, despite the critical nature of the next steps. The heart-lung bypass machine would temporarily take over Eleanor's circulation, allowing Mason to work on the stopped heart. As they connected Eleanor to the bypass circuit, Mason noticed Victor's breathing change slightly, becoming faster, more eager. The man's scientific fascination was overriding his paternal concern, confirming Mason's worst suspicions about his motivations. "Bypass established," Mason confirmed as Eleanor's circulation transferred to the machine. Heart rate decreasing as expected. Preparing for aortic cross-clamping. The next phase was the most delicate, stopping the heart completely to allow for the intricate reconstruction work the Reed procedure required. In a hospital setting, this would involve a team of specialists monitoring every aspect of the process. Here, they were 3 people with varying levels of cardiac surgical experience using modified equipment in a cabin study. "Cross-clamp applied," Mason announced. "Cardioplegia solution administered. Cardiac standstill achieved." Eleanor's heart lay still beneath his hands, a tiny organ no larger than a walnut that held her life in its malformed chambers. Now began the true innovation of the Reed procedure, a complex reconstruction of the left ventricular outflow tract using specialized grafts and tissue engineering techniques Mason had spent years refining. "Beginning ventricular reconstruction," he stated, selecting the specialized instruments designed specifically for this procedure. For the next 2 hours, Mason worked with meticulous precision, his world narrowing to the minuscule surgical field beneath his hands. He repaired the ventricular septal defects, reconstructed the hypoplastic left ventricle, using the specialized grafts Victor had provided, and created new pathways for blood flow that would allow Eleanor's heart to function normally, despite its congenital malformation. Throughout the procedure, Victor remained an effective assistant, anticipating Mason's needs and providing appropriate support. But his focus never wavered from the innovative techniques being demonstrated, the surgeon in him subservient to the researcher documenting a breakthrough procedure. "Ventricular reconstruction complete," Mason announced as he placed the final sutures in the delicate cardiac tissue, preparing to repair the aortic arch. The aortic reconstruction was another critical component of the procedure, creating an adequate outflow pathway from the reconstructed left ventricle. Mason worked quickly but meticulously, aware that every minute on bypass increased the risks to Eleanor's tiny body. "Aortic reconstruction complete," he stated after another hour of intense concentration. Preparing for weaning from bypass. This was the moment of truth, when Eleanor's reconstructed heart would need to resume function on its own. In a hospital setting, this phase would involve a team of specialists carefully monitoring and supporting the transition. Here they had only basic equipment and their combined medical expertise. "Removing cross-clamp," Mason announced. "Rewarming initiated." Eleanor's tiny heart remained motionless for several agonizing seconds after the cardioplegia solution was flushed from her system. Then a small quiver, the first independent contraction of her reconstructed ventricles. "We have electrical activity," Mason reported, watching the monitor closely. "Spontaneous contractions beginning." Another beat, then another. Gradually, Eleanor's heart established a rhythm, irregular at first, then steadying as the muscle responded to its new configuration. "Heart rhythm stabilizing," Mason noted with cautious optimism. "Beginning bypass weaning." Slowly, carefully, they transferred Eleanor's circulation back to her own heart, reducing the bypass support incrementally while monitoring her response. Her reconstructed heart took over, pumping blood through pathways that had been surgically created mere hours before. "Bypass discontinued," Mason announced finally. "Heart functioning independently." The monitors showed a strong, regular heartbeat, dramatically improved from Eleanor's preoperative status. Her oxygen saturation levels, previously concerning despite supplementation, now approached normal ranges with minimal support. "The procedure appears successful," Mason stated, allowing himself a moment of professional satisfaction. "Closing now." As he completed the closure, Mason was acutely aware of Victor's intense scrutiny. The man had witnessed the full read procedure, every innovative technique, every specialized approach Mason had developed over years of research and refinement. Knowledge that Victor would undoubtedly use for his own purposes, ethical or otherwise. "Procedure complete," Mason announced 3 hours after they had begun. Vitals stable, cardiac function significantly improved from baseline. He stepped back from the makeshift operating table, suddenly aware of the exhaustion that had been held at bay by surgical focus. His hands trembled slightly as he removed his gloves, not from age or disuse, but from the intensity of the experience and the weight of its implications. Eleanor lay before them, impossibly small, yet remarkably resilient. Her newly reconstructed heartbeat strongly beneath her closed chest, the monitoring equipment confirming what Mason's surgical instinct already knew: the procedure had been successful. The read procedure, performed for the first time in its fully realized form, had worked exactly as designed. "Extraordinary," Victor breathed, staring at the monitors displaying Eleanor's improved cardiac function. A single-stage correction of HLHS with complete ventricular reconstruction. The implications are revolutionary. Mason ignored him, focusing instead on Eleanor's post-operative care. We need to transfer her back to the warming station and continue close monitoring. The next 24 hours are critical. As they carefully moved Eleanor to the recovery area, Mason could feel Victor's excitement radiating from him like heat. The man had witnessed a medical breakthrough, one he had been pursuing for months, perhaps years. One that aligned perfectly with his research interests, ethical considerations apparently secondary. Olivia was waiting anxiously in the main room, baby Lucas sleeping peacefully beside her. Her eyes widened as they brought Eleanor in fear and hope, warring in her expression. "She's stable," Mason assured her before she could ask. "The procedure was successful. Her heart is functioning better than I could have hoped." Tears filled Olivia's eyes. "She'll live." The next 24 hours are critical for any cardiac surgery, especially in a newborn, Mason cautioned. But yes, barring complications, she should not only live, but potentially have normal cardiac function long-term. Relief transformed Olivia's exhausted features. She reached out, touching Eleanor's tiny hand with gentle fingers. "Thank you," she whispered, looking up at Mason, "for everything." Victor watched this exchange with an odd expression, part satisfaction, part calculation. "We should prepare for transport," he announced. "The helicopter will be waiting, and Eleanor needs proper post-operative care in a fully equipped facility." "She's too unstable to move immediately after surgery," Mason countered. "Standard protocol requires at least 24 hours of close monitoring before transport." Victor's eyes narrowed. "My facility has the best post-operative care available, doctor. Every minute we delay increases risk." "Every minute of unnecessary movement after major cardiac surgery increases risk more," Mason insisted. "She stays here under my supervision until I determine she's stable for transport." The tension between them was palpable. Victor clearly wanted Eleanor under his control as quickly as possible, while Mason was equally determined to protect her from whatever plans Victor had for his daughter with the newly reconstructed heart. Before Victor could argue further, a distant mechanical sound cut through the air, the distinctive thump of helicopter rotors approaching. "The medical transport," Victor said with satisfaction. "Right on schedule." Mason exchanged a quick glance with Olivia, whose eyes reflected his own uncertainty. Was this Victor's helicopter, or the legitimate medical help Rahul had promised to send? "Graves, verify who's arriving," Victor ordered. The security man nodded and headed outside, hand instinctively moving toward his concealed weapon. When the door closed behind him, Victor turned to Mason with a cold smile. "You contacted someone, didn't you, during your private conversation with Olivia?" Mason maintained a neutral expression. "My concern is Eleanor's welfare. She needs proper post-operative care." "Which my facility is equipped to provide," Victor insisted. "I've invested years in this research, doctor." "Did you think I wouldn't prepare for every contingency?" The helicopter sound grew louder, indicating it was preparing to land in a clearing near the cabin. Graves returned his expression grim. "Medical helicopter," he reported. "But not ours. They're claiming to be from Denver Memorial Hospital, sent by a Dr. Patel." Rahul had come through. Relief flooded through Mason, quickly tempered by the realization that Victor would not surrender easily. "How unfortunate," Victor said quietly. "This complicates things." He turned to Graves. "Secure our transportation. We'll need to move quickly." The security man nodded and left again. Victor's demeanor shifted, the mask of concerned father dropping away entirely. "I had hoped for a more collaborative conclusion to our time together, Dr. Reed," he said, his voice now coldly professional. "Your procedure is even more impressive than I anticipated. The applications extend far beyond pediatric cardiac surgery. Applications you intend to exploit without ethical oversight," Mason stated flatly. Victor shrugged.
Ethics are subjective, doctor. Results are not. Your procedure will save countless lives once properly developed and implemented. By you, by someone who understands its true potential, Victor replied. Someone not constrained by outdated moral paradigms. Outside, the helicopter had landed. Voices could be heard approaching the cabin, multiple people trudging through the deep snow. Victor moved suddenly to Eleanor's warming station, checking the monitoring equipment with clinical efficiency. She's stable enough for transport, he announced. We'll be taking her now. No. Olivia struggled to sit up, protective maternal instinct overriding her physical exhaustion. You're not taking her anywhere. Victor ignored her, preparing Eleanor's monitoring equipment for movement. The procedure was successful, Olivia. Our daughter will live a normal life and contribute to scientific advancement that will help countless others. As a research subject, Olivia spat. Like Lucas. As a medical miracle, Victor corrected coldly. The first recipient of the Reed procedure in its complete form. Her case will revolutionize pediatric cardiac care. Mason moved to block Victor's access to Eleanor. She's my patient. She stays under my care. Victor's expression hardened. She's my daughter, doctor, and I have the resources to ensure my parental rights are respected. The cabin door opened before either could respond. Graves entered first, followed by two men in medical uniforms, and behind them Dr. Rahul Patel Mason's former colleague and friend. Mason, Rahul called, his voice reflecting disbelief and concern. We came as soon as we could. Victor's face remained impassive, though Mason could sense the rapid calculations occurring behind his calm exterior. Dr. Patel, Victor greeted smoothly. I'm Dr. Victor Winters. Thank you for responding to this emergency, but we have the situation well in hand. My private medical team is en route to transport my wife and children to our facility. Rahul looked confused, glancing between Victor and Mason. Mason called about a high-risk delivery and a newborn with HLHS requiring urgent intervention. Intervention that has already been provided, Victor replied. Dr. Reed performed the procedure he's been developing quite successfully, I might add. The infant is stable and ready for transport to a proper facility. Rahul's eyes widened as he understood the implication. You performed the Reed procedure here, he asked Mason incredulously. There was no alternative, Mason replied. Eleanor's condition was deteriorating rapidly. Rahul moved to the warming station, checking the infant with experienced hands. His expression shifted from skepticism to amazement as he reviewed the monitoring data. This is remarkable, he admitted. Cardiac function is far better than would be expected post-Norwood. You actually did it, Mason. You completed the procedure as designed. A commotion outside interrupted the moment. More voices approached the cabin, authoritative, official-sounding voices. The distant sound of a second helicopter cut through the air about an hour after Eleanor's surgery was completed. Someone else is coming, Mason observed, moving to the window. Through the clearing snow, he could make out a different type of aircraft, larger than the medical transport Rahul had mentioned. Federal agents, a voice called as the door opened again. Two men in heavy winter gear with FBI windbreakers visible underneath entered, hands near their holstered weapons. Dr. Reed, one of them asked, scanning the room before his eyes settled on Victor. We received an urgent report from Dr. Patel. We were already in the field investigating Dr. Winters's research facility after previous allegations came to light last week. Dr. Victor Winters? One asked, eyes locking onto Victor. Victor's composure slipped momentarily before he regained control. Yes, what is this about? We have a warrant for your arrest in connection with unauthorized human experimentation and the suspicious death of Lucas Winters, the agent stated formally. Dr. Patel forwarded evidence provided by your wife that warranted immediate investigation. The flash drive, Mason realized. Rahul must have received a copy of the evidence during their satellite phone conversation. Victor's face hardened into a mask of cold fury. This is absurd. Any research I conducted was fully authorized under appropriate protocols. The evidence suggests otherwise, Dr. Winters, the agent replied. Please put your hands where I can see them. Victor's eyes darted to Graves, who stood tensely by the door, his hand hovering near his concealed weapon. For a terrible moment, Mason thought violence would erupt in the small cabin. But instead of the expected loyalty, Mason saw something shift in Graves's expression, a subtle relaxation of his posture as he slowly moved his hand away from his weapon. The security man's eyes briefly met Mason's, then flickered to baby Lucas in Olivia's arms, then to Eleanor in her warming station. There was something personal in that look. Perhaps Graves had children of his own, or perhaps even a hardened professional had lines he wouldn't cross. Sir, Graves said quietly to Victor, I believe it's best to cooperate. Victor's face registered shock and betrayal before his professional mask slipped back into place. He hadn't expected this from his loyal security man, another miscalculation from someone who thought he could control everything and everyone. Instead, Victor straightened his shoulders and adopted an expression of professional indignation. This is clearly a misunderstanding that will be resolved quickly. My attorneys will address these unfounded allegations. He extended his hands calmly. I'll cooperate fully, of course. As the agents handcuffed Victor, Mason moved to Olivia's side. She watched her husband with a complex mixture of emotions, relief, grief, vindication, and lingering fear. It's over, Mason told her quietly. Lucas will have justice, and Eleanor will be safe. Tears filled Olivia's eyes. Is it really over? He has connections everywhere. People who believe in his work, who might continue it. We'll address that together, Mason promised. For now, let's focus on getting you and the babies to proper medical care. The next hours passed in a blur of activity. The medical team Rahul had brought stabilized Olivia and the twins for transport. The FBI agents took Victor and a reluctantly cooperative Graves into custody, gathering evidence from the cabin, including Victor's specialized surgical equipment. As they prepared for the helicopter transport, Mason found himself standing beside Eleanor's portable incubator, watching her tiny chest rise and fall with steady, strong breaths. Her monitors showed normal cardiac function, the result of a procedure he had spent years developing but never expected to perform under such extraordinary circumstances. The follow-up scans will be fascinating, Rahul commented, joining him. If her recovery proceeds as the models predicted, this could change pediatric cardiac surgery forever. That was the goal, Mason replied quietly. From the beginning, to give children like Sophie a better chance. Rahul placed a hand on his shoulder. She would be proud, Mason. Eleanor will have the life Sophie should have had. The observation struck Mason deeply. In saving Eleanor, he had in some way honored Sophie's memory, creating meaning from the tragedy that had driven him into isolation 3 years ago. Will you come back? Rahul asked. To medicine. The Reed procedure needs its creator to guide its implementation. Mason looked across the cabin where Olivia sat with Lucas in her arms, watching over Eleanor with fierce maternal vigilance. I don't know, he answered honestly, but I won't be staying on this mountain. The helicopter transport was ready within the hour. As they prepared to leave the cabin that had been Mason's refuge and prison for 3 years, he took a final look around. The abandoned Christmas Eve dinner table still stood in the corner, 3 places set for ghosts who would never arrive. Mason touched the photograph of Eleanor and Sophie one last time, then placed it carefully in his pocket. He wouldn't be returning to this place of isolation and grief. Whatever the future held, it would not be found in running from the past. As they loaded Olivia and the twins into the helicopter, she reached for Mason's hand. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the rotor noise. "You and the babies will receive the best care available," Mason assured her. "I'll make sure of that." "And you," Olivia pressed. "Where will you go?" Mason hesitated the question, catching him unprepared. For 3 years, his existence had been defined by isolation and the past. Now, unexpectedly, he faced a future without clear parameters. "I'll stay until Eleanor's recovery is certain," he said finally. "After that, I don't know." Olivia's eyes held his, something unspoken passing between them, a connection forged through shared trauma and the miracle of Eleanor's surgery. "She'll need ongoing cardiac care," Olivia said quietly, "from someone who understands the procedure better than anyone." The implication was clear, an invitation, or perhaps a plea for Mason to remain involved in their lives beyond this crisis. "It would be my privilege," Mason found himself saying, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice, "to monitor Eleanor's progress, to document the procedure's success." He paused, recognizing that his clinical language was a shield against deeper feelings. "And to be there for both of you, however you need me." Olivia reached out her hand, finding his. "We've both lost too much to be alone anymore," she said simply. "Maybe we were meant to find each other." Mason didn't believe in fate, hadn't for 3 years, but standing there feeling the warmth of human connection after years of isolation, he could almost reconsider. Not a romantic connection, at least not yet. They were both too broken, too haunted by their pasts, but something foundational, something that might grow in time into something meaningful. A second chance for both of them. Before he could respond, the medical team signaled readiness for departure. Mason stepped back as the helicopter doors closed, watching as it lifted off, carrying Olivia and her twins toward safety and proper medical care. Standing in the clearing as snow began to fall again, Mason felt something he hadn't experienced in 3 years. A sense of purpose beyond survival and isolated research. The Reed procedure had worked. Eleanor would live. And somewhere in that success, Mason had found a path forward from the grief that had defined his existence since losing his family. He turned toward the second helicopter that would transport him to Denver, leaving behind the cabin with its memories and ghosts. Christmas Day was ending, but for Mason Reed, something new was beginning, a return to the world of the living, not as the man he had been before tragedy struck, but as someone forged in that fire, carrying both its scars and its wisdom. Eleanor and Lucas would need someone who understood their unique journey. Olivia would need support, navigating the aftermath of Victor's crimes and the media attention that would inevitably follow. And the medical community would need guidance, implementing the Reed procedure safely and ethically. All paths led away from isolation, away from the past, and toward whatever uncertain future awaited beyond the mountain's snow-covered peak. As the helicopter lifted off, Mason felt the weight of the past 3 years begin to lighten, not disappearing, but transforming into something he could carry forward, a memory of what was lost and what might yet be found. The mountains fell away beneath them, growing smaller in the helicopter's window. Mason closed his eyes, feeling the vibrations of the aircraft around him, movement after years of stillness. Progress. After years of stasis, life after years of merely existing. "Merry Christmas, Sophie," he whispered too quietly for anyone else to hear. "I think I've finally found my way back."
Below, snow continued to fall on the empty cabin, covering all tracks and traces in a blanket of pristine white nature's way of offering a clean slate, a fresh beginning. Just as the mountain had once provided refuge for a broken man seeking escape, it now released him back to the world changed, but healing, carrying with him the whispers in the snow that had guided him home.